Hi guys! Tonight we explore a land that has carried many names across thousands of years, a place where deserts glow under golden sunsets, where mountain winds whisper through ancient stone ruins, and where the memory of empire still lingers quietly in the dust of forgotten roads. You begin your journey in the deep past long before modern borders, long before the word Iran appears on any map. Imagine yourself standing on a vast plateau in the ancient Near East. The air is dry and cool in the early morning. To the west rise the rugged Zagros Mountains. To the north stretch distant snowy peaks. Beyond them lie lands that will one day be called Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and Central Asia. In the quiet light of dawn, you walk through a settlement of mud brick homes. Smoke rises slowly from small hearth fires. Traders load animals with woven baskets. The people around you speak early Iranian languages that sound unfamiliar to modern ears, but will one day shape the identity of an entire civilization. The land you are standing on will eventually become one of the most influential regions in human history, yet the name Persia has not fully emerged yet. The story begins with small tribes moving across the Iranian plateau around 3,000 years ago. These people are part of a larger Indo-Iranian migration that spreads across Central Asia and into the Middle East. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that among these tribes was one group known as the Persians. They settled in a region called Pars, located in what is today southern Iran. Over time, this name Pars slowly transformed when foreigners began speaking about the region. Greek travellers and historians would later pronounce it as Persis. From that word came the name that echoed through ancient history, Persia. You continue walking across the dusty plain. The sunlight grows warmer as the morning advances. Caravans move slowly between settlements. Sheep graze along hillsides. Farmers tend small irrigation channels that carry water from mountain streams. Life here is not easy, but it is steady. People grow barley and wheat. They trade metals and textiles. Small local rulers control valleys and villages. For centuries, the region exists on the edge of larger empires such as Assyria and Babylon. And yet something is slowly forming here, a new political power. But before that power rises, the land itself shapes the people who live here. The Iranian plateau is a place of extremes. Summers can be scorching, winters in the mountains can be bitterly cold. Vast deserts stretch across the center of the region, forcing communities to rely on clever systems of water management. One fascinating detail that surprises many historians is the invention of underground water channels known as kanats. These narrow tunnels carried mountain water across long distances beneath the earth, allowing farmers to irrigate fields in otherwise dry lands. Some of these kanats were so well engineered that they continued functioning for more than 1,000 years. Even today, a few still operate. As you walk beside one of these early irrigation systems, you can hear the quiet trickle of water beneath the soil. It is a gentle sound, almost soothing. Civilizations often grow where water flows, but identity grows through stories and language. And their people living here are beginning to share a common heritage. Their myths speak of ancient kings and heroic battles. Their traditions include fire rituals that will later become central to a religion called Zoroastrianism. Their social structure values loyalty to tribe and family. These cultural threads will later bind together one of the largest empires the ancient world has ever seen. But historians do not always agree on how quickly that transformation happened. Some researchers question if the early Persians immediately saw themselves as a unified people, or whether the idea of Persian identity developed slowly over many generations. Archaeological discoveries suggest that for a long time the Persians were simply one tribe among many across the Iranian plateau. Yet history sometimes turns on the ambitions of a single individual. As the sun climbs higher, you imagine a distant future moment that will change everything. A man named Saur will appear. But for now the land remains quiet. Shepherds guide their flocks across grassy hills. Children chase each other between houses built of clay and straw. Traders carry small goods across dusty roads that wind between valleys. The Persian world is still forming, and the name Persia itself will spread far beyond these mountains only when outsiders begin writing about it. Greek historians will one day describe the powerful empire that emerges here, and through their writings the name Persia will become famous across the Mediterranean. Interestingly, the people living in this land often used a different word for their homeland. They called it Aryanum. It meant the land of the Aryans. Over centuries, that word would slowly evolve into something very close to the modern name Iran. But that transformation will take thousands of years. For now, you continue walking across the early Persian landscape, listening to the quiet sounds of daily life. Wind moves softly through dry grass. Distant bells ring from animals wandering through fields. The scent of wood smoke drifts through the cool air. It feels peaceful. And yet beneath this calm surface lies the beginning of a story that will reshape continents. Soon tribes will unite. Soon armies will march. Soon the name Persia will echo across the ancient world. But in this moment, as the sun rises over the Iranian plateau, you simply stand in the quiet birthplace of a civilization still waiting to awaken. The journey from Persia to Iran has only just begun. The morning light grows stronger as you continue across the Iranian plateau. The quiet villages and scattered farms slowly fade behind you, replaced by wider roads and larger settlements. Traders move steadily along dusty paths. Camels carry sacks of grain copper tools and woven fabrics. Somewhere beyond the distant hills, a new kind of power is beginning to rise. You now find yourself in the 6th century before the Common Era. The air feels warmer here. The land of Pars lies ahead, a rugged region of valleys and rocky mountains that will soon give birth to one of history's most remarkable leaders. His name is Cyrus. You walk through a modest town surrounded by stone walls and simple buildings made from mud brick. People speak respectfully of a young ruler who has recently taken control of a small kingdom. His authority is still limited, but there is a quiet confidence in the way his followers talk about him. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that Cyrus the Great founded the Achaemenid Empire around 550 BCE, creating what many historians consider the first true superpower of the ancient world. But standing here at the beginning of his story, nothing about the surroundings yet suggests such enormous ambition. The early Persian kingdom is still relatively small. It exists under the shadow of larger powers, especially the powerful Median Empire that dominates much of the region. Cyrus himself is technically a vassal ruler under Median authority, yet something unusual is happening beneath the surface. As you walk through the marketplace, you hear rumors spreading among merchants and travelers. Cyrus is gathering allies. Tribal leaders are pledging loyalty. Soldiers train beyond the town walls. And slowly, quietly, the balance of power begins to shift. One evening, you stand near a small fire where elders discuss the young king. They describe him as calm and thoughtful rather than loud or boastful. He listens carefully to advisors and treats conquered peoples differently from many rulers of his time. That approach will soon change the fate of entire civilization. But even Cyrus's early life remains partly mysterious. Some ancient sources describe a dramatic childhood story in which a Median king dreamed that Cyrus would overthrow him. According to this tale, the king ordered the infant Cyrus to be killed, but the child survived and was secretly raised by a shepherd family. Scholars remain divided about whether this story reflects historical truth or whether it was later created to make Cyrus appear like a legendary hero chosen by destiny. Regardless of the exact details, one thing soon becomes clear. Cyrus is not content to remain a minor ruler. Around 550 BCE, he leads a rebellion against the Medes. You imagine the tension of those early battles. Armies move through narrow mountain passes. Soldiers carry spears, bows, and curved swords. Dust rises as thousands of feet march across dry ground. Eventually, the Median Empire collapses. Cyrus becomes ruler not only of the Persians, but also of the Medes. This moment marks the true beginning of the Persian Empire. And from here, the expansion happens with astonishing speed. You follow the growing army as it moves westward. The soldiers travel across Mesopotamia through lands that have already seen many empires rise and fall. Cities open their gates. Some resist briefly, but Cyrus often allows conquered people to keep their traditions and religions. This policy becomes one of his most remarkable strategies. Unlike many ancient conquerors who ruled through fear alone, Cyrus gains loyalty by offering stability and respect for local customs. One unusual historical detail reveals just how far this approach extended. After conquering Babylon in 539 BCE, Cyrus issued a decree allowing displaced communities to return to their homelands and rebuild temples. Among those allowed to return were Jewish communities who had been exiled by earlier Babylonian rulers. Because of this act, Cyrus is remembered in parts of the Hebrew Bible as a liberator rather than a conqueror. As you walk through the massive city of Babylon shortly after its capture, you can almost feel the strange calm that followed the conquest. There are no burning streets, no collapsing walls. Instead, life continues. Markets reopen, priests perform rituals in temples, farmers continue bringing grain from nearby fields. Cyrus has taken control of one of the richest cities in the world with surprisingly little destruction. Some historians argue that this peaceful transition may have been carefully planned through alliances inside Babylon itself. Others believe the city simply surrendered when it realized resistance would be useless. The exact details remain uncertain, but the result is undeniable. Within only a few decades, Cyrus builds an empire stretching from Central Asia to the Mediterranean Sea. You imagine standing on a high hill overlooking this vast territory. Caravans cross deserts carrying spices and silk. Ships move along distant coastlines. Royal messengers ride swiftly along newly secured roads. For the first time, many different cultures find themselves connected under a single political system. The Persian Empire becomes enormous, and yet Cyrus himself never appears obsessed with luxury. Ancient accounts often describe him as disciplined and practical. Even as his empire grows, he continues leading armies personally and travelling across the lands he rules. Eventually his campaigns take him eastward towards Central Asia. It is there during a military expedition around 530 BCE that Cyrus dies. The circumstances of his death remain uncertain. Some ancient writers claim he fell in battle against nomadic tribes. Others suggest different explanations for his final days. Archaeologists continue discussing which version may be closest to reality. But one thing is certain. By the time of his death, Cyrus has created a political structure that will outlive him for generations. His empire stretches across 3 continents. His leadership style has reshaped how rulers think about governing diverse populations, and the name Persia now carries enormous weight across the ancient world. You walk slowly toward a quiet stone structure rising from the plain near Pasargadae. It is simple, almost humble compared to later imperial monuments. This is believed to be the tomb of Cyrus the Great. Wind moves softly across the grass surrounding it. Empires will rise and fall in the centuries ahead, but the foundations laid by Cyrus will echo through history, shaping the identity of Persia for thousands of years. And the journey toward what the world will one day call Iran continues. The wind grows cooler as you continue your journey across the growing Persian Empire. The lands ruled by Cyrus now stretch so far that weeks of travel separate one end of the empire from the other. Snow-capped mountains rise in the north. Endless deserts lie to the east. Fertile river valleys spread across Mesopotamia at the west. Standing in the center of such a vast realm, you begin to wonder how any ruler could possibly control territory this large. Empires throughout history often collapse under the weight of distance and communication. Messages take months to arrive. Local governors become too powerful. Rebellions erupt in distant provinces. Yet the Persian Empire does something remarkable. Instead of collapsing, it builds a system strong enough to manage this enormous territory. You now arrive in the reign of a later ruler, a king named Darius I. The year is around 520 BCE. The empire has survived the death of Cyrus and passed briefly through political turmoil, but under Darius it begins transforming into one of the most organized states of the ancient world. A well-established historical fact tells us that Darius reorganized the empire into administrative regions called satrapies. Each satrapy was governed by an official known as a satrap, who managed taxes, law enforcement, and military defense within their region. As you walk through the administrative center of one of these provinces, you see scribes carefully recording shipments of grain, livestock, and silver taxes. Officials consult clay tablets filled with writing. Messengers arrive on horseback carrying sealed letters from distant cities. The system feels surprisingly modern. Each region keeps its local traditional languages and religious practices, but the Persian king remains the ultimate authority. What truly makes the empire function smoothly, however, is something even more impressive. Roads. You step onto a long stone path stretching across the landscape. Travellers move steadily along it. Soldiers escort wagons loaded with goods. Royal couriers ride past at remarkable speed. This is part of the famous Royal Road, one of the most advanced communication systems of the ancient world. The main route stretches more than 2,000 kilometres, connecting the city of Susa in Persia to the western city of Sardis near the Aegean Sea. At regular intervals along the road stand relay stations where fresh horses wait for government messengers. Because of this system, official messages can travel across the empire in about a week. Without it, the journey might take several months. Ancient Greek historian Herodotus later described the royal couriers with admiration, noting that neither snow, rain, heat, nor darkness stopped them from completing their journey. As you watch a messenger gallop down the road, dust rising behind his horse, you realize that this network is more than just transportation. It is the nervous system of the empire. Information moves quickly. Orders reach distant provinces. Local officials remain connected to the royal court. But administration alone cannot hold an empire together. Trust also matters. One interesting and lesser-known detail from this period involves the practice of royal inspectors, sometimes called the king's eyes and ears. These officials travelled secretly throughout the empire, observing local governors and reporting directly back to the king. Their presence helped prevent corruption and rebellion by ensuring that even powerful satraps remained accountable. Yet historians still debate how extensive this surveillance system truly was. Some researchers believe the king's eyes and ears were formal inspectors regularly dispatched from the royal court. Others suggest the idea may have been exaggerated by later Greek writers who were fascinated by the power of Persian kings. Standing in a provincial palace, you imagine how tense it might have felt for a satrap knowing that a royal observer could appear without warning. Still, Persian rule generally allows local cultures to continue functioning normally. Temples remain open, local languages remain in use. Regional laws often stay unchanged, as long as taxes are paid and loyalty is maintained. This approach becomes one of the empire's greatest strengths. Unlike many conquerors who attempt to erase local identities, Persian rulers govern through cooperation and stability. You walk through a busy market town where merchants from different regions gather. One trader speaks an early form of Persian. Another uses Aramaic, which has become the empire's common administrative language. A traveller from Egypt displays linen cloth while a merchant from Central Asia sells precious stones. The empire feels less like a single culture and more like a vast network of connected societies. Darius also introduces something that further strengthens this connection: standardized coinage. Small silver coins known as darics begin circulating across the empire, making trade easier and more predictable. Holding one of these coins in your hand, you notice the image stamped into the metal. It shows a Persian king holding a bow, symbolizing royal authority and protection. The coin itself travels far beyond Persia's borders. Merchants carry it through markets in Greece, Egypt, and Central Asia. In a quiet way, it spreads the influence of Persia everywhere commerce flows. You continue walking toward the imperial capital of Persepolis, one of the grandest construction projects of the era. Huge stone terraces rise from the base of nearby mountains. Massive staircases lead upward toward palaces decorated with intricate carvings. Workers from many regions of the empire help build these structures. Some carve stone reliefs showing delegations from distant lands bringing gifts to the Persian king. Others shape columns so tall they seem to touch the sky. Archaeologists continue discussing whether these carvings represent conquered peoples paying tribute or cooperative allies participating in imperial ceremonies. The imagery shows figures dressed in different regional clothing, each carrying offerings such as textiles, animals, or precious metals. Rather than scenes of violence, the carvings emphasize unity. Standing at the top of the grand staircase, you look out across the terraces of Persepolis. Wind moves across the open stone courtyards. Delegations from across the empire once gathered here for celebrations, especially during the Persian New Year festival known as Nowruz. In those moments, representatives from dozens of cultures stood side by side beneath the authority of the Persian king. The system built by Cyrus and refined by Darius now holds together one of the largest political structures the world has ever seen. Roads carry messages across deserts and mountains. Satraps govern distant provinces. Inspectors quietly monitor loyalty. Coins circulate through markets. And above it all stands the Persian king, ruler of a vast and remarkably organized empire. The foundations of Persian power have never been stronger. But beyond the western mountains, another civilization is beginning to watch this growing empire with suspicion. Soon Persia will meet Greece, and the story of how the world remembers Persia will change forever. The sun rises slowly over the stone terraces of Persepolis. Soft golden light spreads across the carvings on the palace walls, revealing scenes of travellers, diplomats, and servants from dozens of distant lands. You walk down the broad ceremonial staircase, your footsteps echoing faintly against the ancient stone. Beyond the palace complex, the empire continues its daily rhythm. Empires are often remembered for wars and kings, but most people inside them live ordinary lives. To understand Persia at the height of its power, you step away from the royal court and wander into the towns and villages where everyday life unfolds. The air smells of baked bread and wood smoke as you enter a busy settlement near the imperial capital. Narrow streets twist between houses made of mud brick. Courtyards sit behind wooden gates shaded by trees that soften the dry heat of the Iranian plateau. Children run through the streets carrying clay toys. Farmers lead donkeys loaded with sacks of grain. Women carry water from nearby wells in tall ceramic jars balanced carefully on their hips, are widely recognized. Historical fact tells us that the Achaemenid Empire at its peak governed around 40 to 50 million people. That number represented a remarkable portion of the entire world population at the time, yet most of those millions were not soldiers or nobles. They were farmers, craftsmen, traders, and labourers whose quiet work kept the empire functioning. You step into a market square where merchants arrange their goods beneath simple cloth awnings. The sounds of bargaining drift through the air. Copper tools shine in the sunlight. Baskets overflow with dates, figs, and almonds. A potter displays freshly fired bowls painted with simple patterns. The Persian Empire connects lands stretching from Egypt to Central Asia, and that connection shows itself clearly in the marketplace. Spices from India appear beside woven fabrics from Anatolia. Egyptian linen hangs beside rugs from mountain villages. Traders speak a mixture of languages, yet business continues smoothly. Aramaic has quietly become the administrative language of the empire, allowing officials and merchants from different regions to communicate with relative ease. You hear it spoken among scribes writing contracts on parchment and clay tablets. But at home, people still speak their local languages. One family invites you into their courtyard as they prepare the evening meal. A clay oven sits in one corner, its heat slowly baking flatbread against the inner walls. The smell is warm and comforting. Dinner is simple but nourishing. Bread, lentils, herbs, and occasionally meat if the household can afford it. Life here is not so luxurious, yet it is still. That stability is one of the great achievements of Persian rule. Unlike many ancient empires, the Persians rarely forced cultural uniformity. People across the empire kept their local traditions, clothing styles, and religious practices. One particularly fascinating historical detail comes from clay tablets discovered near Persepolis in the 20th century. These tablets reveal detailed records of wages and rations given to workers building the royal complexes. They show that labourers, including women, received payments in food and supplies. Some records even mention maternity support for women working on royal construction projects. For an empire more than 2,000 years old, these administrative details offer a surprisingly human glimpse into daily life. Still, historians continue discussing how widespread such policies truly were. Some researchers believe these records represent a relatively organised and humane labour system. Others suggest that conditions likely varied greatly depending on region and local authority. Standing near the palace workshops, you watch craftsmen carefully carving stone reliefs. Each figure is detailed with remarkable precision. You see representatives from Egypt wearing long linen garments. Delegates from Central Asia carry horses as gifts. Men from distant mountain regions present woven textiles. The carvings show no signs of battle or conquest. Instead, they emphasize cooperation. Whether this imagery reflects reality or royal propaganda remains a subject of debate among scholars. But the artistic message is clear. The Persian Empire presents itself not only as powerful but also as orderly and harmonious. You leave the palace complex and travel along one of the empire's many roads leading toward the countryside. Fields stretch across the valleys where farmers grow wheat and barley. Irrigation channels carry precious water through dry soil, allowing crops to survive the harsh climate. In some regions underground, canal tunnels transport water across long distances beneath the ground. When you kneel beside one of these channels, you can hear water flowing quietly beneath the earth, hidden but essential to life in this landscape. Villages often gather around these water systems, forming small communities that depend on careful cooperation to manage the resource. Even religion reflects the rhythms of daily life. As evening approaches, you notice a small fire burning within a simple temple structure. Inside, priests maintain a sacred flame. This fire represents purity and truth within the teachings of Zoroastrianism, a religion that holds deep influence across Persian society. The teachings emphasize moral choices between truth and falsehood, light and darkness. Although the exact role of Zoroastrianism within the Achaemenid Empire is still discussed by historians, as many believe its ideas influenced the ethical framework of Persian kingship. Some scholars argue that Persian rulers used these spiritual concepts to justify policies of fairness and tolerance. Others remain uncertain whether royal propaganda later exaggerated this connection. Outside the temple, the sky begins turning deep orange as sunset approaches. Families gather in courtyards. Farmers return from fields. Traders pack away their goods for the night. The Persian Empire at its height is vast, complex, and surprisingly interconnected. Across mountains, deserts, and rivers, millions of people continue their daily routines under the authority of distant kings. Yet most of them may rarely think about the empire itself. Their lives revolve around seasons, harvests, markets, and family. Still beyond the western edges of this peaceful evening landscape, tension quietly grows. Across the sea, small Greek city-states are beginning to fear the immense power of Persia. Soon misunderstandings, pride and ambition will bring two very different worlds into conflict, and the image of Persia in the eyes of history will begin to change. The night air cools the land as you travel westward away from the palaces of Persepolis and the quiet villages of the Persian heartland. Days pass along the royal road. The landscape slowly changes. Rugged Iranian mountains give way to rolling hills, then to coastal plains where the scent of the sea drifts through the wind. You're approaching the western edge of the Persian Empire. Beyond these lands lie the scattered Greek city-states. Unlike the vast Persian realm, Greece is not a single kingdom. Instead, it is a collection of independent cities such as Athens, Sparta, and Corinth. Each governs itself, each guards its independence fiercely. At first, the relationship between these worlds is cautious but manageable. Persia already controls territories in Anatolia, where many Greek-speaking communities live. These coastal cities trade with both the Persian interior and the Greek mainland across the Aegean Sea. Markets remain busy. Ships cross the waters carrying olive oil, wine, metals, and textiles. But beneath the surface, tension quietly builds. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that the Greco-Persian Wars began around 499 BCE, when several Greek cities in Anatolia revolted against Persian rule. This uprising, known as the Ionian Revolt, soon pulled mainland Greek cities into a much larger conflict. You imagine standing along the harbour of a coastal city where the rebellion begins. Ships rock gently in the water as sailors whisper about resistance against Persian authority. Some local leaders hope that distant Athens will send support. Others fear the consequences of challenging such a powerful empire. Eventually the rebels act. Persian administrative centres are attacked. One city even burns the regional capital of Sardis. The flames rising above Sardis send a clear message to the Persian king: rebellion. From the perspective of Persia, this uprising is not simply a local dispute. It is an open challenge to imperial order. When news of the revolt reaches King Darius, preparations begin for retaliation. Persian armies gather along the western frontiers. Ships are assembled along the coast. You watch soldiers preparing for a campaign that will carry them across the sea toward mainland Greece. The scale of the Persian military impresses even experienced travellers. Archers adjust their bows. Cavalry riders prepare horses, if soldiers carry shields made of wicker and leather. Persian armies include warriors from many regions of the empire. Medes Persians, Egyptians, and others march together beneath the same banners. Yet historians still discuss the exact size and composition of these forces. Ancient Greek writers often described enormous Persian armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Modern scholars suspect these figures may have been exaggerated to emphasize the dramatic nature of the conflict. Even so, the Persian military presence is undeniably powerful. You now cross the Aegean Sea with the advancing fleet. The waters shimmer beneath the sunlight. Dozens of ships move together across the waves carrying soldiers toward unfamiliar shores. The first major clash comes at a place called Marathon in 490 BCE. Standing on the wide coastal plain, you can see the tension in the air. Persian forces land near the beach, preparing to march inland. Across the field, Athenian soldiers gather in tight formations. The battle that follows will become one of the most famous moments in Greek history. Against expectations, the Greek forces defeat the Persian army. The victory becomes legendary in the Greek world. But for Persia, the defeat is more of a setback than a catastrophe. The empire remains vast and powerful, yet something important has changed. Greek writers begin telling stories about these battles, shaping how later generations will remember Persia. One unusual historical detail shows how powerful these stories became. Many Greek sources describe Persian soldiers as overly luxurious or weak compared to the disciplined Greek warriors. These portrayals influenced Western historical narratives for centuries, even though archaeological evidence suggests Persian armies were well organized and capable. In reality, the Persian Empire had successfully conquered far larger and more powerful civilizations before encountering the Greeks. Still, the rivalry continues. Years later, Darius' son Xerxes prepares an even larger campaign against Greece. You stand near the shores of the Hellespont as engineers construct an extraordinary project. They are building bridges across the sea. Hundreds of ships are anchored side by side, their decks connected with wooden planks and ropes, forming a floating roadway that allows the Persian army to cross from Asia into Europe. Watching thousands of soldiers march across this bridge feels almost unreal. The campaign that follows includes several famous battles such as Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea. Each of these encounters will become deeply embedded in Greek storytelling. Yet archaeologists and historians continued debating how accurately these events were recorded. Some researchers argue that Greek writers emphasize heroic resistance while minimizing Persian successes in other parts of the war. What remains clear is that these wars created a powerful cultural memory. For the Greeks, Persia became the image of a vast Eastern empire opposed to their own ideals of independence. For Persia, the Greek lands represented a distant frontier that proved more difficult to control than expected. As you leave the battlefield, plains behind the sun begins to set over the western horizon. The Greco-Persian Wars do not destroy the Persian Empire. The empire continues to thrive for more than a century afterward. But something subtle has changed in how history will remember Persia. Much of what later generations learn about the empire will come from Greek sources, and those sources often tell the story from only one side. The quiet complexity of Persian life, the roads, markets, villages, and administrative systems you saw earlier, will often fade behind dramatic tales of war. Yet the empire itself continues standing strong. For now, Persia remains one of the greatest powers on earth. But far beyond these lands, another young conqueror will one day look eastward toward Persia, and his arrival will shake the empire to its core. The first light of dawn spreads across the stone terraces of Persepolis once again. The empire you have been travelling through remains vast and powerful. Roads still carry messengers across mountains and deserts. Markets still bustle with merchants speaking many languages. Villages still wake each morning to the rhythms of farming and trade. Yet maintaining such an enormous realm requires constant attention. You now step deeper into the machinery of Persian power. The Persian king rules over lands stretching from the Indus Valley in the east to the shores of the Mediterranean in the west. Without careful organization, such distances could easily tear the empire apart. So you begin to observe how this system truly works. In the capital, officials gather inside cool stone halls lined with tall columns. Scribes sit cross-legged with tablets and reed pens recording taxes and shipments arriving from distant provinces. Messengers come and go with sealed orders bearing the authority of the king. At the center of this world stands the Persian monarch often described as the King of Kings. A widely recognized historical fact tells us that Persian rulers used the title Shahanshah, meaning King of Kings, to emphasize their authority over many subordinate rulers and regional governors throughout the empire. But this title is more than ceremonial. The king does not simply control territory. He coordinates an intricate network of officials, commanders, and administrators who keep the empire functioning. You travel to one of the satrapies, the regional provinces that divide the empire. Each satrapy is governed by a satrap who acts as the king's representative in that region. As you arrive in the provincial capital, the atmosphere feels both orderly and cautious. The satrap's palace stands near the center of the city. Guards watch the gates carefully. Inside, scribes manage records of tax payments and agricultural production. Couriers arrive with reports from surrounding towns. The satrap himself oversees law enforcement, taxation, and military defense. But despite his power, he does not rule alone. Persian kings intentionally divide authority to prevent rebellion. Alongside the satrap operates a separate military commander responsible for local troops. There is also a royal secretary who sends independent reports directly back to the king. This system ensures that no single official becomes too powerful. One fascinating historical detail reveals how carefully the empire monitored its governors. The Persian court occasionally dispatched royal inspectors known informally as the King's Eyes. These officials travelled across the provinces without warning, examining how satraps managed their territories and reporting directly to the royal court. Their arrival could create great anxiety among local authorities. No satrap wanted to be accused of corruption or disloyalty. Yet historians continued debating how frequently these inspectors actually appeared. Some scholars believe the King's Eyes formed a regular intelligence network across the empire. Others suspect the system may have been more symbolic than practical, with the threat of inspection sometimes serving as a deterrent, even when inspectors were rarely sent. As you walk through the administrative offices, you notice documents written in several languages. Persian rulers communicate through Aramaic for official administration because it is widely understood across many regions of the empire. But inscriptions celebrating royal achievements often appear in Old Persian, carved into stone monuments that proclaim the power of the king. One such monument stands high above the landscape at Behistun. You imagine climbing the rocky cliff where a massive inscription was carved during the reign of Darius. The carving shows the king standing victorious over defeated rebels, while a long text describes how he restored order to the empire after a series of uprisings. This inscription becomes one of the most important archaeological discoveries in modern times because it helped scholars decipher ancient cuneiform writing. Standing below the carving, you feel the immense authority it was meant to convey. The message is clear. The king rules with divine support and absolute power. But the daily functioning of the empire depends not only on authority, but also on loyalty. You travel along another stretch of the royal road, where relay stations provide fresh horses for government messengers. Couriers arrive breathless from long journeys, exchanging tired mounts for rested ones before continuing across the landscape. Information flows constantly through this network. Taxes collected in distant provinces are recorded and transported to central treasuries. Military reports travel quickly to the royal court. News of unrest can be addressed before it spreads. The empire breathes through this circulation of information. In nearby towns, life continues much as it always has. Farmers harvest grain beneath the hot sun. Shepherds guide flocks across hillsides. Craftsmen shape metal tools and carve wooden furniture. The Persian system does not demand that people abandon their traditions. Instead, it asks for loyalty, taxes, and peace. Yet despite this stability, the empire occasionally faces rebellion. The sheer size of Persian territory means that distant regions sometimes challenge royal authority. When that happens, the king responds swiftly. Armies march along the roads you have already travelled. Loyal satraps gather soldiers. Royal decrees reaffirm the authority of the throne. And usually order returns. But as the years pass, new pressures begin building on the edges of the empire. To the west, Greek cities continue guarding their independence. To the north and east, nomadic groups watch the wealth of Persian lands with growing interest. And within the empire itself, rivalries between powerful families quietly develop. Standing once more at the grand halls of Persepolis, you look across the stone reliefs showing delegations from many lands bringing gifts to the king. The empire still appears strong and unified. Yet history often changes slowly before it changes suddenly. Far to the west, in a land of small city-states and restless ambition, a young leader is beginning to dream of conquest. One day his armies will march eastward, and the system that has held Persia together for generations will face its greatest challenge. The empire still appears calm as you leave the terraces of Persepolis behind. Caravans continue moving along the royal road. Messengers still ride between provinces carrying royal orders. Markets remain full of merchants speaking many languages. For nearly 2 centuries, the Persian Empire has been one of the most powerful political systems on earth. But far beyond the western mountains, something new is taking shape. You now travel westward across Anatolia and the eastern Mediterranean. The climate softens. Olive trees grow along rocky hills. Small Greek towns cluster near harbours, where fishing boats drift gently with the tide. The Greek world is still fragmented into independent city-states, yet a powerful new kingdom has emerged to the north, Macedon, and its young king has ambitions far greater than his homeland. His name is Alexander. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that Alexander III of Macedon launched his invasion of the Persian Empire in 334 BCE, beginning one of the most dramatic campaigns in ancient history. At the start, however, the idea seems almost impossible. The Persian Empire remains enormous. Its population numbers in the tens of millions. Its territories stretch across 3 continents. Its armies include soldiers from dozens of regions. Macedon, by comparison, is a relatively small kingdom, but Alexander's army is disciplined and highly trained. You stand beside the shores of the Hellespont as the Macedonian forces prepare to cross into Asia. The sea glitters beneath the morning sunlight. Soldiers carry long spears called sarissas, forming tightly organized infantry units known as phalanxes. Cavalry riders adjust their armor while commanders review maps of Persian territory. Alexander himself is only in his 20s, yet he carries enormous confidence. Ancient writers describe him as energetic, charismatic, and fearless in battle. Some stories claim that before crossing into Asia, Alexander visited the legendary city of Troy to honor the heroes of the Trojan War. Scholars still debate how accurate this story may be, but it reflects how deeply Greek mythology shaped Alexander's imagination. He does not see himself merely as a king, he sees himself as part of heroic tradition. Soon the Macedonian army crosses into Persian territory. The first major confrontation occurs at the Battle of the Granicus River. Standing near the riverbank, you watch as Persian cavalry attempts to block the Macedonian advance. Horses splash through the water as soldiers clash in chaotic combat. Despite fierce resistance, Alexander's forces break through. This victory opens the gates of Anatolia. Cities across the region begin surrendering or switching allegiance. Some welcome Alexander as a liberator from Persian rule, others simply recognize the changing balance of power. Still, the Persian Empire has not yet fully responded. King Darius III now rules the empire, and he begins assembling a massive army to confront the invading force. You travel south toward the narrow plains near the city of Issus, where the 2 armies finally meet. The battlefield lies between mountains and the sea, creating a confined space that limits the advantage of the larger Persian army. Ancient Greek sources describe the battle as dramatic and intense. Persian soldiers form long lines across the plain while Alexander leads a decisive cavalry charge toward the center. Eventually the Persian lines break. King Darius flees the battlefield. This moment becomes one of the most significant turning points in the entire campaign. But historians continue discussing how exactly the battle unfolded. Greek writers naturally focused on Alexander's heroism, yet some scholars suggest the narrow terrain played a crucial role by preventing the Persian army from fully deploying its numerical advantage. Regardless of the details, the consequences are enormous. After Issus, Alexander begins capturing major cities across the eastern Mediterranean. You walk through the famous city of Tyre during its siege, where Alexander's engineers construct a massive causeway across the sea to reach the island fortress. It takes months of effort. Eventually, the city falls. The campaign continues south into Egypt, where Alexander is welcomed as a ruler rather than a conqueror. In Egypt, he founds a new city that will bear his name, Alexandria. The young king's ambitions continue growing, but the final confrontation with Persia has not yet come. That moment arrives at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE. You stand on a wide-open plain carefully prepared by the Persian army to allow chariots and cavalry to maneuver effectively. King Darius has assembled an enormous force drawn from across the empire. War chariots line the battlefield. Cavalry units wait along the flanks. Infantry soldiers form deep formations stretching across the horizon. For Persia, this is last chance to stop Alexander's advance. When the battle begins, dust rises from thousands of moving soldiers and horses. The clash of weapons echoes across the plain. Alexander leads another daring cavalry charge directly toward the beaten Persian king. Once again, Darius withdraws from the battlefield. With that moment, the heart of the Persian Empire lies open. Over the following months, Alexander marches through the empire's great capitals: Babylon, Susa, Persepolis. You return once more to the stone terraces you visited earlier in your journey. But this time the atmosphere feels very different. Some ancient sources claim that Persepolis was burned during Alexander's occupation, possibly as revenge for earlier Persian invasions of Greece. Archaeologists and historians still discuss whether the destruction was intentional or the result of an accidental fire during a royal celebration. Standing among the damaged ruins, you sense the end of an era. The empire created by Cyrus the Great has fallen, yet Persian culture itself does not disappear. The land, the people, and their traditions remain, and the story of Persia is far from over. New rulers will arrive. New empires will rise, but the memory of Persia will continue shaping the identity of this land for centuries to come. The smoke from Persepolis slowly fades into the dry air of the Iranian plateau. The empire that once stretched across continents has fallen, yet the land itself remains. Cities still stand, roads still connect distant regions. Farmers continue working fields beneath the same wide sky. You walk through the quiet aftermath of conquest. Alexander the Great now rules the territories that once belonged to the Persian kings. His empire stretches from Greece to the Indus River. But as you travel through these lands, something becomes clear. Conquering an empire is one thing, holding it together is something else entirely. Alexander spends years moving constantly across his vast domain. He leads campaigns into Central Asia, and even reaches the edges of India. Along the way, he begins adopting certain Persian customs, wearing elements of Persian royal clothing and integrating Persian nobles into his administration. A well-established historical fact tells us that Alexander encouraged marriages between his Macedonian officers and Persian noble families in an attempt to blend the ruling elites of both cultures. In the city of Susa, he even organized a large ceremony where many of his generals married Persian women. The goal seems ambitious. Alexander appears to imagine a new kind of empire where Greek and Persian traditions combine into a single political system. Yet historians continue debating how genuine this vision truly was. Some scholars believe Alexander sincerely hoped to create a blended Greco-Persian civilization. Others argue that his policies were mainly practical strategies to secure loyalty in newly conquered lands. Either way, the cultural mixing begins shaping the region in subtle ways. You travel through cities where Greek-style buildings now stand beside older Persian structures. Greek soldiers mingle with local populations in markets and streets. New coins display images of Alexander alongside symbols familiar to Persian traditions. For a brief moment, the world seems to be merging, but the unity does not last long. In 323 BCE, Alexander dies unexpectedly in the city of Babylon at only 32 years old. The cause of his death remains one of the most famous mysteries of ancient history. Some researchers suspect illness such as malaria or typhoid fever. Others have wondered whether poisoning could have played a role. Ancient sources describe his final days in dramatic and sometimes contradictory ways. What is certain is that his death leaves a massive empire without a clear successor. Almost immediately, his generals begin competing for control. These men are known to history as the Diadochi, meaning successors. Over the following decades, Alexander's empire fractures into several rival kingdoms. You now find yourself in one of those new states. The Seleucid Empire. This kingdom controls much of the former Persian territory, including Mesopotamia and large portions of the Iranian plateau. Its rulers descend from one of Alexander's generals named Seleucus. As you walk through the city of Seleucia along the Tigris River, you notice clear signs of Greek influence. Public buildings follow Greek architectural styles. Statues of Greek gods appear in temples and plazas. Greek becomes an important language of administration and culture in many urban areas. Yet the deeper layers of Persian life remain very much alive. Outside the cities, rural communities continue practicing long-established traditions. Farmers still cultivate wheat using irrigation systems that existed long before Alexander's arrival. Local languages remain widely spoken. The land remembers its old identity. One fascinating historical detail reveals how resilient Persian traditions proved to be during this time. Even under Greek rule, many local administrative practices continued following patterns established during the Achaemenid Empire. Systems of taxation, regional governance, and infrastructure management remained familiar to local populations. In other words, while the rulers had changed, much of the daily functioning of the empire still followed Persian models. As you travel across the Iranian plateau, you begin to notice another shift slowly developing. Greek control over the eastern regions of the Seleucid Empire grows weaker with distance. The farther you move from the Mediterranean world, the more Persian and Iranian cultural traditions dominate local life. Caravans move across the same ancient trade routes connecting Central Asia with Mesopotamia. Nomadic groups roam the steppelands north of the plateau. Small kingdoms and tribal leaders begin asserting their independence. In these distant territories, Greek authority often exists more on paper than in reality. Scholars continue discussing how strongly Seleucid rulers actually controlled the eastern parts of their empire. Some historians believe that many local leaders operated with significant autonomy, acknowledging Greek authority only loosely. Others argue that Seleucid kings maintained stronger influence than once assumed, using military garrisons and alliances to preserve stability. Standing at the edge of a dusty frontier town, you watch a caravan arriving from the east. The travelers bring silk, precious stones, and stories from lands even farther beyond the empire. Trade continues, linking distant civilizations, and from these eastern regions a new power will soon emerge. They are not Greeks. They are not Macedonians. They are a people from the Iranian world itself. Their name will soon become famous across history. The Parthians. These rising warriors will challenge Greek rule and begin restoring Iranian political power across the lands once ruled by Persia. The story of Persia did not end with Alexander. It simply entered a new chapter. The road beneath your feet grows quieter as you travel farther east across the Iranian plateau. Greek-style cities still appear in certain regions, but their influence slowly fades the deeper you move into the heart of the old Persian world. The land begins to feel familiar again, shaped by traditions that existed long before Alexander's armies arrived. Caravans pass through wide valleys where mountain winds sweep across the grasslands. Nomadic riders guide horses along distant ridges. Traders carry silk and spices across routes that stretch towards Central Asia. In these eastern territories, the Seleucid kings struggle to maintain firm control. Their capital lies far away in the western parts of their empire. Messages travel slowly. Local leaders often govern with a degree of independence. And it is here, on the northeastern frontier of the old Persian world, that a new power quietly begins to rise. You arrive in a region known as Parthia. The landscape is rugged and windswept. Small settlements cluster near rivers and oasis towns. Nomadic tribes move through the open plains, skilled in riding and archery. Among these groups are the Pani, a tribe of Iranian origin, who live beyond the traditional boundaries of the Seleucid state. A widely recognized historical fact tells us that around the middle of the 3rd century BCE, a leader named Arsaces led the Pani tribe in a rebellion that established what would become the Parthian Empire. You imagine the moment when this transformation begins. Arsaces and his followers move swiftly across the frontier, taking advantage of the Seleucid Empire's weakening control. Greek governors in the region struggle to respond effectively. Local populations already familiar with Iranian traditions sometimes view the new rulers as closer to their own cultural roots. Gradually, the Parthians secure control over Parthia itself. But they do not stop there. Over the following decades, Parthian power expands westward across the Iranian plateau. Their warriors become known for extraordinary skill on horseback. You stand on a high ridge watching a group of Parthian riders practicing archery. Their horses move swiftly across the open land while the riders twist their bodies backward, releasing arrows with remarkable precision even while retreating. This tactic will later become famous as the Parthian shot. It allows riders to fire arrows at pursuing enemies while galloping away, creating confusion and fear among opposing forces. The technique proves extremely effective in battle. Unlike the heavy infantry formations used by Greek armies, Parthian warfare relies heavily on mobile cavalry. Fast-moving horse archers and heavily armoured cataphract riders dominate the battlefield. These tactics will soon bring them into conflict with one of the most powerful civilizations in the Mediterranean world, Rome. But before that confrontation unfolds, the Parthian state continues growing stronger. You travel through the Parthian capital city of Ctesiphon, located near the Tigris River. The city becomes a major political and commercial centre linking the Iranian plateau with Mesopotamia. Markets bustle with traders arriving from distant regions. Silk from China, spices from India, and goods from the Mediterranean pass through these busy streets. The Silk Road trade network flourishes during this era. Although the famous trade routes connect many civilizations, the Parthians play a crucial role as intermediaries controlling key segments of the route between East and West. One fascinating historical detail reveals how carefully the Parthians protected their position in international trade. Some historians believe Parthian authorities deliberately limited direct contact between Roman merchants and Chinese traders, ensuring that goods passed through Parthian territory and allowing them to profit from the exchange. However, scholars continue discussing how intentional this strategy truly was. Some researchers argue that geography and logistical challenges naturally forced trade through Parthian-controlled regions rather than deliberate political planning. Regardless of the exact reasons, the Parthian Empire becomes an important bridge between distant civilizations. Culturally, Parthian society reflects a mixture of influences. Greek artistic styles introduced during the Seleucid period continue appearing in sculpture and architecture. At the same time, Iranian traditions grow increasingly dominant in political life. Royal titles emphasize Iranian heritage and local customs shape governance across the empire. You walk through a ceremonial gathering where Parthian nobles assemble around their king. Unlike the centralized authority of the earlier Persian Empire, Parthian rulers share power with powerful noble families. These aristocratic clans control large territories and provide military support to the king when needed. This decentralized system sometimes strengthens the empire by allowing regional flexibility, but it can also create internal rivalries. Historians still debate whether the Parthian political structure should be viewed as a loose federation of noble families or as a more traditional monarchy with powerful aristocratic partners. As evening approaches, you ride along the western frontier of the empire, where tension with the Rome begins to grow. Roman legions march eastward seeking influence over territories near the Euphrates River. The Parthians guard their borders carefully. Eventually these two great powers collide. One of the most famous encounters occurs at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE. You stand on the dusty plains where Roman legions face Parthian cavalry for the first time. The Roman soldiers expect a conventional battle. Instead, they face waves of horse archers who strike quickly, retreat, and return again and again. Roman formations struggle against this unfamiliar style of warfare. By the end of the battle, the Roman army suffers a devastating defeat. The victory shocks the Roman world and establishes the Parthians as a formidable rival. As night falls across the plains, you reflect on how history has turned once again. Greek rulers replaced the old Persian kings. Now Iranian warriors have reclaimed much of the land. The name Persia may not yet fully return, but Iranian power has risen again across the plateau, and the long story of this land continues unfolding through new empires and new identities. The road grows busier as you continue travelling through the Parthian world. Caravans stretch across the horizon like slow-moving rivers of animals and merchants. Camels carry bundles of silk wrapped carefully in cloth. Wagons creak beneath loads of spices, glassware, and rare stones. You have entered one of the most important crossroads of the ancient world. The Parthian Empire now sits between great civilizations. To the west lies Rome. To the east stretch the kingdoms of Central Asia and the distant Han Empire of China. Between them flows a network of trade routes that historians will later call the Silk Road. The name itself will only become popular centuries later, but the exchange of goods, ideas, and travelers along these routes is already transforming the world. You stand beside a dusty road near the city of Merv, where traders gather before beginning long journeys across deserts and mountains. The early morning air is cool and the scent of animals and spices fills the market. Merchants speak many languages. Some come from China carrying rolls of fine silk that shimmer softly in the sunlight. Others arrive from India with ivory pepper and fragrant resins. Roman traders bring glass vessels, metal tools, and wine from Mediterranean vineyards. A well-established historical fact tells us that silk became one of the most valuable commodities traded along these routes, highly prized in the Roman world for its beauty and rarity. Roman writers even complained that their empire was sending vast amounts of gold eastward to pay for this luxurious fabric. But the merchants gathered around you are interested in more than silk. Trade includes horses, gemstones, medicines, perfumes, paper, and many other goods. Even ideas and technologies travel along these routes. As the day grows warmer, a caravan prepares to depart. Dozens of camels kneel while handlers load their cargo. Each animal carries bundles carefully balanced across its back. The caravan leader studies a rough map of desert wells and mountain passes that will guide the journey. Travel along these routes is slow and dangerous. Bandits sometimes attack isolated caravans. Sandstorms can erase entire paths across the desert. In winter, mountain passes become nearly impossible to cross. Yet despite these risks, trade continues. The rewards are too valuable to ignore. One unusual historical detail reveals just how far some of these connections reached. Chinese records from the Han dynasty describe an envoy named Zhang Qian who travelled westward during the 2nd century BCE. His journey helped establish diplomatic and trade contacts between China and regions of Central Asia. Through these connections, knowledge of distant lands slowly spread across Eurasia. Some Chinese writers even described a mysterious Western empire believed to be Rome, though direct contact between the two civilizations remained extremely rare. Scholars continue discussing how much the Romans and Chinese actually knew about one another during this period. Some historians believe information travelled primarily through intermediaries such as Parthian and Central Asian traders. Others suggest occasional indirect diplomatic contacts may have occurred. Standing beside the departing caravan, you realize that these trade routes form something like the arteries of the ancient world. Goods move slowly but steadily across thousands of kilometers, and the Parthian Empire sits directly at the center of this exchange. Cities along the routes grow wealthy from commerce. You walk through the bustling streets of Ctesiphon once again. Markets overflow with goods from distant regions. Silk fabrics hang beside Persian carpets. Indian spices fill the air with rich scents. Artisans craft jewelry using gemstones from faraway mines. The city feels alive with movement. Cultural exchange becomes just as important as economic trade. Greek artistic styles blend with Iranian traditions. Buddhist ideas travelling from India reach parts of Central Asia. Scientific knowledge passes between scholars from different regions. Over time, the Silk Road becomes not only a trading network but also a bridge between civilizations. Yet the prosperity of this system depends on political stability. The Parthians must protect long stretches of road across deserts and mountains. Garrisons guard key cities. Local leaders maintain security in oasis towns where caravans stop to rest. Sometimes conflicts disrupt the trade. Roman armies occasionally clash with Parthian forces along their shared frontier near the Euphrates River. Each empire wants influence over important trade corridors. Still, neither side fully conquers the other. Instead, a kind of uneasy balance develops. Historians often describe this relationship as one of the earliest examples of a geopolitical rivalry between two great powers. The Parthians dominate the Iranian plateau and key sections of the Silk Road. Rome controls much of the Mediterranean world. Between them lies a frontier where diplomacy and warfare constantly alternate. As evening approaches, you climb a small hill overlooking a caravan route disappearing into the desert. The sky glows orange as the sun begins to sink behind distant mountains. Below you, another caravan slowly moves westward, its line of camels stretching across the sand. Each bundle they carry connects distant civilizations that may never meet face to face. Through these journeys, cultures influence one another across thousands of kilometers, and the land once ruled by the ancient Persian kings remains at the center of that connection. But as centuries pass, the Parthian Empire itself will begin to weaken. Powerful noble families compete for influence. Regional rulers challenge central authority. And from the southern lands of Persia itself, a new dynasty will soon rise. A dynasty that will revive the ancient traditions of Persian kingship once again. The desert wind moves gently across the Iranian plateau as you continue traveling south from the great caravan cities. Trade routes remain active behind you, but the landscape ahead feels quieter, older somehow, as if the land itself remembers a deeper past. The Parthian Empire still controls much of this region, yet signs of strain are beginning to appear. Local nobles can but for influence. Regional governors sometimes challenge the authority of the central king. Political unity grows fragile. In the southern lands of Persia, however, a different kind of movement begins to take shape. You arrive in the province of Pars, the same region where the ancient Persian Empire once began centuries earlier, under Cyrus the Great. The hills and valleys here carry long memories of earlier dynasties. Old traditions still survive among local communities. Temples continue maintaining sacred fires. Stories of the ancient Achaemenid kings are still whispered by priests and scholars. The ruins of earlier Persian capitals remain scattered across the landscape, silent reminders of a powerful past. Among the peoples of this region, the idea of Persian identity has never fully disappeared, and now a new leader begins to draw strength from those memories. His name is Ardashir. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that Ardashir I defeated the Parthian king Artabanus IV around the year 224 CE, establishing a new dynasty known as the Sasanian Empire. You imagine the tension of those years before the decisive battle. Ardashir begins as a regional ruler in Pars, gradually expanding his authority over neighbouring territories. His supporters present him not merely as another local warlord, but as a restorer of ancient Persian kingship. This message resonates strongly among many communities who still remember the glory of the earlier Persian Empire. As you travel through villages across Pars, you hear people speak about the possibility of renewed unity. The Parthian rulers in distant northern regions feel increasingly disconnected from local traditions. Ardashir offers something different. He presents himself as a defender of Persian heritage. Eventually, the growing conflict between Ardashir and the Parthian monarchy leads to a decisive confrontation. You stand on a wide battlefield where the two forces finally meet. Dust rises as cavalry units maneuver across the plain. Soldiers shout commands while banners ripple in the wind. When the battle ends, the Parthian king is defeated. With that moment, nearly 5 centuries of Parthian rule come to an end. A new empire begins. The Sasanian Empire quickly establishes itself as one of the most powerful states of late antiquity. Ardashir and his successors work carefully to rebuild a centralized government similar in spirit to the earlier Achaemenid system. Royal authority becomes stronger once again. You travel to the new imperial capital where massive palaces rise beside the Tigris River. Grand ceremonial halls welcome delegations from across the empire. Nobles gather in elaborate courts where the king sits beneath richly decorated arches. The image of kingship grows more formal and sacred. Sasanian rulers present themselves as chosen protectors of divine order. One fascinating historical detail from this era appears in the rock carvings scattered across Iran. You climb toward one of these monumental reliefs carved directly into a cliff face. The stone image shows Ardashir receiving a royal ring from a divine figure often associated with Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of Zoroastrian belief. The scene symbolizes divine approval of the king's authority. These carvings send a powerful message to anyone traveling through the region. The new Persian monarchy rules not only by military strength but also by sacred legitimacy. At the same time, the Sasanian state strengthens connections with Zoroastrian religious institutions. Fire temples become important centers of worship. Priests known as magi help maintain sacred flames that represent purity and truth. However, historians continue debating how closely religion and political authority were actually intertwined during the early Sasanian period. Some scholars believe the dynasty actively promoted Zoroastrianism as a state religion to unify the empire. Others argue that religious diversity remained more common than royal inscriptions might suggest. Standing outside a fire temple at dusk, you watch the sacred flame flickering behind stone walls. The quiet glow seems almost timeless. Around the temple, ordinary life continues. Farmers cultivate fields along irrigation canals. Traders carry goods through market streets. Craftsmen produce metalwork, textiles and pottery for both local use and long-distance trade. Yet the political landscape surrounding these daily activities has changed dramatically. The new Sasanian rulers are ambitious. They see themselves not only as successors to the Parthians, but also as heirs to the much older Persian kings of antiquity. This renewed sense of Persian identity will soon bring them into conflict with a familiar rival, Rome. Once again, the lands between the Mediterranean and the Iranian plateau will become a frontier between two powerful empires. As night settles over the plains of Pars, the stars begin appearing above the mountains. The Persian world has been reborn, but the challenges of empire are never simple, and the next centuries will bring both greatness and struggle to the rulers who now claim the legacy of Persia. The early morning mist drifts slowly above the Tigris River as you approach the Sasanian capital once again. The empire, reborn under Ardashir, is growing stronger with each passing decade. Cities expand, armies train along the frontiers, royal authority spreads across the lands that once belonged to the ancient Persian kings. But with renewed power comes renewed rivalry. To the west lies a civilization just as determined to defend its influence, Rome. For centuries, the Roman and Parthian empires had faced one another across the Euphrates frontier. Now the new Sasanian rulers interpret that the border along with the same tensions, and almost immediately conflict began. A widely recognized historical fact tells us that the Sasanian Empire and the Roman Empire fought numerous wars between the 3rd and 7th centuries, making their rivalry one of the longest sustained geopolitical struggles of the ancient world. Standing near the frontier, you can feel the quiet tension in the air. Roman forts rise along the western banks of the Euphrates. Across the river, Sasanian outposts guard the eastern side. Patrols move cautiously along dusty roads, while diplomats attempt to negotiate temporary peace agreements. But peace rarely lasts long. You travel with a Sasanian army preparing for one of these confrontations. These soldiers gather outside a fortified city where commanders review battle plans beneath colourful banners. Unlike the fast-moving cavalry forces of the Parthians, the Sasanian military combines several different types of units. Heavy cavalry, known as cataphracts, wear armour that covers both rider and horse in metal plates. Infantry soldiers carry shields and boars. War elephants sometimes appear in battle formations towering above the battlefield. The empire has clearly invested significant resources into building a powerful military. Soon the armies march westward. You arrive near the Roman frontier where tension escalates into open war. Dust rises from thousands of marching soldiers as the two empires once again test each other's strength. One particularly famous moment occurs during the reign of the Sasanian king Shapur I. In the year 260 CE, Roman Emperor Valerian leads an army eastward to confront the Persians. The confrontation ends in disaster for Rome. Shapur defeats the Roman forces and captures the emperor himself. The event shocks the Roman world. Never before had a Roman emperor been captured alive by a foreign ruler. You stand before a monumental rock carving created to celebrate the victory. The relief shows Shapur on horseback receiving the submission of the defeated Roman emperor. The message carved into the stone is unmistakable. Persia has reasserted its strength. One unusual historical detail surrounding this event has fascinated historians for centuries. Some ancient sources claim that Valerian spent the rest of his life as a prisoner performing humiliating tasks for the Persian king. Other accounts suggest his treatment may not have been as harsh as later Roman writers described. Scholars remain divided about how accurately these stories reflect reality. Roman historians may have exaggerated the humiliation to emphasize the tragedy of the emperor's defeat. Regardless of the exact details, the psychological impact of the event is enormous. The Sasanian Empire now stands as a serious rival to Rome. You travel through fortified cities along the frontier where both sides construct defensive walls and strongholds. Merchants still move cautiously through border regions, but military patrols have become far more common. Despite these conflicts, the two empires also develop complex diplomatic relationships. Envoys travel between royal courts carrying messages and gifts. Temporary peace treaties allow trade to continue along certain routes. Cultural exchanges occur even during periods of tension. Historians continue discussing how these two great powers managed to coexist for so many centuries without completely destroying one another. Some researchers suggest the immense resources required for total conquest made prolonged stalemate more practical. Others argue that both empires recognized the benefits of maintaining a balance of power along their shared frontier. As you walk through a Sasanian city far from the battlefield, daily life continues as it always has. Markets remain busy. Artisans shape intricate metalwork and textiles. Farmers cultivate fields fed by irrigation canals stretching across the plains. The empire invests heavily in architecture and engineering. You approach one of the most remarkable structures of the era, the Great Arch of Ctesiphon. This enormous vaulted hall rises above the landscape with a sweeping brick arch that once formed part of a royal palace complex. Even today, the scale of the structure feels astonishing. Standing beneath the arch, you can imagine the grandeur of imperial ceremonies that once filled this space. Ambassadors from distant lands would have walked through these halls carrying gifts for the Persian king. The Sasanian Empire sees itself as the legitimate heir to ancient Persian greatness. Its rulers emphasize a continuity with the traditions of earlier dynasties. They celebrate Persian culture, language, and royal symbolism. Yet beyond the borders of this powerful empire, the world continues changing. New religious ideas are spreading across distant lands. Political pressures slowly build within both Rome and Persia. And after centuries of rivalry, both empires will eventually face a challenge neither fully expects. As evening shadows stretch across the great arch of Ctesiphon, the wind carries the quiet sounds of the city settling into night. The rivalry between Persia and Rome continues, but far to the south in the deserts of Arabia, a new force is beginning to emerge, one that will soon transform the entire region. Night settles quietly over the great cities of the Sasanian Empire. Lamps glow softly inside courtyards while the last traders of the day close their stalls. In the distance, the steady flicker of sacred fire burns within temple walls. As you continue your journey through this reborn Persian world, you begin to notice how deeply religion shapes the rhythm of daily life. In markets and villages, people speak about truth, order, and the eternal struggle between light and darkness. Priests carefully tend temple fires that must never be allowed to fade. Ritual purity influences everything from food preparation to burial customs. These traditions belong to one of the oldest organized belief systems in human history, Zoroastrianism. A widely recognized historical fact tells us that Zoroastrianism, founded by the prophet Zoroaster sometime in the distant past, became closely associated with Persian identity and held a central place in the religious life of the Sasanian Empire. Yet even the origins of this faith remain partly mysterious. Scholars continue discussing when exactly Zoroaster lived. Some believe he may have lived as early as the 2nd millennium BCE. Others suggest a later date closer to the early Persian empires. Standing outside a quiet fire temple at dawn, you watch priests carefully tending a sacred flame inside a stone chamber. The fire burns steadily, fed by carefully prepared wood. Its glow reflects against polished metal vessels placed nearby. In Zoroastrian belief, fire represents purity, truth, and the presence of divine order. But the flame itself is not worshipped. Instead, it symbolizes the light of truth in a world where good and evil constantly struggle for influence. Inside the temple, priests recite ancient prayers from texts known as the Avesta. The language of these hymns is old and poetic, preserved across generations by careful oral tradition before eventually being written down. One fascinating historical detail reveals how carefully these sacred words were protected. For centuries, Zoroastrian priests memorized long sections of the Avesta and passed them down orally before written versions were widely produced. This tradition helped preserve the teachings even during periods of political upheaval. As you listen to the soft chanting echo through the temple hall, the sound feels almost timeless. The core message of Zoroastrianism centers on a cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood. Ahura Mazda represents wisdom, order, and goodness. Opposing this divine force is Angra Mainyu, often described as the destructive spirit associated with chaos and deception. Humans are believed to play an important role in this cosmic struggle. Every choice between honesty and deceit, kindness and cruelty contributes to the larger battle between light and darkness. These ideas strongly influence Persian concepts of kingship during the Sasanian period. Rulers present themselves not simply as political leaders, but as guardians of divine order. Rock carvings across Iran show kings receiving symbols of authority from divine figures, reinforcing the idea that their rule reflects cosmic balance. However, historians remain divided about how completely Zoroastrianism functioned as a formal state religion. Some scholars believe Sasanian rulers actively promoted the faith as a unifying national identity. Others suggest that religious diversity continued across the empire, with many communities practicing Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, and other beliefs. You travel through a busy city where different religious communities live side by side. In one district, you see a Christian church where believers gather quietly for prayer. Nearby, Jewish merchants conduct business in market stalls. Farther along the street, Zoroastrian priests pass wearing distinctive white robes. The Sasanian Empire contains many cultures and traditions, yet Zoroastrianism remains closely tied to the official identity of the state. Even burial customs reflect the faith's concern for purity. Because earth and fire are considered sacred elements, traditional Zoroastrian practice avoids burying or burning the dead. Instead, bodies are placed in special stone structures known as towers of silence, where natural elements gradually return them to the environment without contaminating soil or flame. Standing on a hill overlooking one of these towers, you see a circular stone platform exposed to the open sky. The structure appears quiet and solemn against the landscape. Archaeologists continue discussing how widely these burial practices were followed across different regions of the empire. Some areas may have used alternative methods depending on local traditions and environmental conditions. As evening approaches, the fire temples once again glow with steady light. Families gather in homes nearby, sharing meals of bread, herbs, and roasted meats. Children listen to stories about ancient heroes and wise kings who defended truth against darkness. Religion here is not separate from daily life. It shapes ethics, law, and identity. It also strengthens the cultural continuity linking the Sasanian world with the much older Persian traditions that came before it. Yet while these sacred fires burn steadily across the empire, political storms are beginning to gather beyond the horizon. The long rivalry with Rome continues, draining resources and attention. And to the south, in the deserts of Arabia, new ideas are spreading among tribal communities. Ideas that will soon travel far beyond the sands where they first emerged. Ideas that will eventually reach the Persian world itself. For now, the sacred fires still burn brightly across the empire, but history is quietly preparing for another transformation. The wind blows gently across the Iranian plateau as the centuries pass under Sasanian rule. The empire remains powerful, its cities vibrant with trade and culture. Fire temples continue glowing through the night. Royal courts hold elaborate ceremonies beneath towering arches. Yet beneath this surface, stability signs of strain slowly begin to appear. You walk through the busy streets of Ctesiphon once more. Merchants still fill the markets and travellers continue arriving from distant lands. But conversations among soldiers and officials carry a tone of concern. The empire has been fighting wars for a very long time. For generations, Persia and Rome have confronted each other along their shared frontier. Armies march, treaties are signed, then battles begin again. This endless rivalry drains enormous resources from both sides. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that one of the most destructive phases of this conflict occurred in the early 7th century when the Sasanian Empire and the Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of Rome, fought a massive war lasting more than 2 decades. You now travel to that turbulent period. The Persian king Khosrow II rules the empire during these dramatic years. Under his command, Persian armies achieve remarkable victories against Byzantine forces. Cities fall one after another. Sasanian troops capture major territories including Syria, Egypt, and even Jerusalem. For a moment it appears as though Persia might permanently dominate the eastern Mediterranean. Standing inside a captured city, you can sense the excitement among Persian soldiers. Their victories seem unstoppable. Maps in the war tent show Persian influence spreading farther west than it has in centuries. Yet success brings new challenges. Maintaining control over these distant lands requires enormous logistical effort. Armies must remain stationed across vast territories. Supply lines stretch thin. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire begins reorganizing its defenses under a determined ruler named Heraclius. The war that follows becomes exhausting for both empires. You travel across battlefields where soldiers from Persia and Byzantium clash again and again. Dust rises from cavalry charges. Fortified cities endure long sieges. Entire regions experience years of instability. Eventually the tide begins to turn. Heraclius launches a bold counter-offensive deep into Persian territory. His armies strike at the heart of the Sasanian Empire itself. The conflict grows increasingly desperate. One fascinating historical detail from this period reveals how dramatically the war affected ordinary life. Archaeological evidence from several regions shows signs of abandoned villages and disrupted agricultural production during these years of prolonged warfare. Fields once carefully irrigated begin to fall into neglect as communities struggle to survive. Historians continued discussing how deeply the conflict weakened both empires. Some researchers believe the war left Persia and Byzantium economically and militarily exhausted just before a new force emerged from Arabia. Others argue that the empires might still have recovered had circumstances been slightly different. Inside the Persian court, political tensions grow. Military defeats shake confidence in the king. Noble families begin questioning royal leadership. Eventually, internal conspiracies lead to the overthrow of Khosrow II. The once powerful monarch is removed from the throne. His death marks the beginning of a period of years of political chaos. You walk through the halls of the royal palace where uncertainty fills the air. Successive rulers take power for short periods before being replaced again. Noble factions compete for control. Administrative stability begins to crumble. In only a few years, multiple kings rise and fall. The centralized authority that once held the empire together weakens dramatically. At the same time, the long war with Byzantium finally ends, but not with a decisive victory for either side. Both empires are simply too exhausted to continue. The Persian armies withdraw from the territories they had conquered. Byzantine forces return to their lands, but the damage has already been done. Standing on a quiet hill overlooking the capital, you watch as the sun sets over the once mighty empire. The Sasanian state still exists, but it is no longer the confident power it once was. Political instability spreads through the court. Economic resources have been strained by decades of warfare. And perhaps most importantly, many frontier defences have weakened. Far to the south, across the deserts of Arabia, small tribal communities are undergoing profound changes of their own. A new religious movement has begun uniting tribes that were once divided. At first, the leaders of Persia pay little attention to events unfolding in the Arabian Peninsula. After centuries of facing Rome as their primary rival, the deserts to the south seem distant and unimportant. But history often changes in unexpected ways. As night falls across the weakened Sasanian Empire, a new chapter of transformation quietly approaches. The sacred fires still burn within their temples, yet soon a new faith will arrive that will reshape the identity of Persia forever. The desert air grows warmer as you travel southward toward the Arabian frontier. Behind you lies the Sasanian Empire, still vast but now weakened by years of war and political turmoil. Royal authority has become uncertain. Noble families compete for influence. Border defences are thinner than they once were. For centuries, Persia had focused most of its attention westward toward Rome. Now the direction of history begins shifting. Across the deserts of Arabia, something new is emerging. You imagine standing in the city of Mecca during the early 7th century. The town rests along important caravan routes linking southern Arabia with the markets of Syria and Mesopotamia. Traders gather near the Kaaba, a cube-shaped sanctuary surrounded by smaller shrines dedicated to many tribal gods. Arabian society at this time consists largely of independent tribes connected by kinship and trade. But a new voice begins speaking about unity and faith. His name is Muhammad. A widely recognized historical fact tells us that the Prophet Muhammad began preaching a message of monotheism around the year 610 CE, calling people to worship a single God and to live according to principles of justice, charity, and moral responsibility. At first, the message spread slowly. Some people accept the teachings, others strongly resist them. Tensions grow within the community of Mecca until Muhammad and his followers migrate north to the city of Medina in an event later known as the Hijra. This moment becomes the starting point of the Islamic calendar. Over the following years, the new religious movement gains strength. Tribal divisions begin fading as communities unite under the shared belief in Islam. The message emphasizes equality among believers and encourages cooperation across tribal lines. As the movement grows, the political landscape of Arabia begins changing rapidly. You travel across desert caravan routes where tribes once separated by long rivalries now form alliances under a common faith. Small communities that previously fought for control of wells and grazing land now find themselves connected through a larger spiritual identity. Eventually, most of the Arabian Peninsula becomes united. This transformation has enormous consequences. For the first time in many generations, Arabia possesses both religious unity and organized leadership capable of directing large armies. Meanwhile, the great empires surrounding Arabia remain exhausted from decades of warfare. Persia and Byzantium have spent years fighting one another. Their resources are depleted, their frontier defences weakened. At first, Persian leaders pay little attention to the developments in Arabia. The desert tribes had long been seen as peripheral actors compared to the massive struggles between the great empires. Yet this perception soon changes. After the death of Muhammad in 632 CE, the new Islamic state begins expanding beyond Arabia. Armies move north toward the territories of both Byzantium and Persia. You stand near the edge of the desert watching one of these early expeditions preparing to march. The soldiers carry simple equipment compared to the heavily armoured forces of the great empires, but they possess something equally powerful: unity of purpose. The early battles between Muslim forces and the Persian army occur along frontier regions where imperial defences have already been weakened. One fascinating historical detail from this period involves the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, fought around 636 CE. During the battle, Persian forces included war elephants, massive animals armoured for combat and trained to disrupt enemy formations. These creatures initially frightened the opposing troops and caused confusion across the battlefield. Yet the battle ultimately ended in defeat for the Persian army. Historians continued discussing the exact reasons behind the rapid collapse of Sasanian resistance. Some scholars emphasize the political instability already weakening the empire. Others point to economic exhaustion after years of war with Byzantium. Still others highlight the organizational strength and motivation of the expanding Islamic forces. It is likely that all of these factors played a role. As you travel through cities across the Persian heartland, you witness a society experiencing profound change. Some regions resist fiercely at first. Other cities negotiate peaceful surrender in exchange for protection and continued local administration. Gradually, the political structure of the Sasanian Empire begins to dissolve. In 651 CE, the last Sasanian ruler Yazdegerd III dies while fleeing eastward. With his death, the long line of Persian kings that began centuries earlier comes to an end. Yet the land itself remains. Villages continue farming the same fields. Merchants continue trading in markets. Persian language and cultural traditions persist among the population. The political empire has fallen, but the civilization beneath it has not disappeared. You walk through the streets of a Persian city now governed by new administrators under the expanding Islamic world. Life feels different, yet also strangely familiar. New religious ideas begin spreading through communities that once followed older traditions. But cultural memory remains strong. The story of Persia is not finished. It is entering another transformation. And in the centuries ahead, Persian culture will help shape the very civilization that replaced the old empire. The desert wind fades behind you as you travel deeper into the lands that were once ruled by the Sasanian kings. The political structure of the old Persian Empire has disappeared, yet the cities and villages continue breathing with life. Markets open at sunrise. farmers guide oxen across familiar fields. The rhythm of daily existence moves forward even as history shifts around it. You now find yourself inside a new political world. The early Islamic caliphates have taken control of vast territories, stretching from Arabia across Persia and into Central Asia. Administrators arrive to govern newly acquired provinces. Soldiers establish garrisons in major cities. Arabic becomes an important language of administration and religious scholarship. Yet the transformation is not immediate. Persia does not simply vanish. Instead, Persian society gradually adapts within the larger framework of the Islamic world. A widely recognized historical fact tells us that many former Sasanian administrative practices continued under the early Islamic caliphates because local Persian officials possessed valuable experience managing complex bureaucratic systems. You walk through the offices of a provincial governor, where scribes record taxes and agricultural production. Many of the administrative methods look surprisingly familiar. Documents are carefully organized. Regional officials report to central authorities. Irrigation systems continue supporting large farming communities. Persian expertise proves essential for maintaining stability across these territories. Over time, Persian elites begin participating actively in the new Islamic political structure. Some convert to Islam while maintaining their cultural heritage. Others serve as administrators, scholars, and advisors within the expanding caliphate. One fascinating historical detail reveals how influential Persian culture became during this period. The Abbasid Caliphate, which rises to power in the 8th century, establishes its capital in Baghdad not far from the former Sasanian centers of power. Many Persian traditions influence the court culture of this new empire, including styles of administration, ceremony, and literature. Scholars continue discussing how deeply Persian culture shaped the development of the Islamic Golden Age. Some historians argue that Persian intellectual traditions played a crucial role in preserving and expanding scientific knowledge. Others emphasize the broader multicultural environment that included Arab, Greek, Indian, and Central Asian influences. Walking through the vibrant city of Baghdad, you see evidence of this cultural blending everywhere. Libraries contain manuscripts translated from Greek philosophy and Persian science. Scholars gather in quiet rooms debating mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Traders fill the markets with goods arriving from across Asia and the Mediterranean. The atmosphere feels energetic and curious. Persian scholars become some of the most important contributors to this intellectual world. You visit a quiet study room where a young scholar reads ancient texts by candlelight. Around him lie manuscripts discussing philosophy, medicine, and poetry. Names like Al-Khwarizmi, who helped develop early algebra, and Avicenna, known for his medical writings, will later become famous across the world. Many of these thinkers write in Arabic, the language of scholarship in the Islamic world. Yet their cultural background remains deeply connected to Persian heritage. Language itself becomes one of the most powerful tools of cultural continuity. Over time, a new literary form of Persian language emerges using the Arabic script. This form of Persian, often called New Persian, begins appearing in poetry, storytelling, and historical writing. One unusual historical detail shows just how influential this language became. By the 10th century, Persian literature had spread far beyond the Iranian plateau, reaching courts in Central Asia, India, and parts of the Middle East. Persian poetry became admired across many regions of the Islamic world. You listen as a poet recites verses beneath a garden pavilion. The rhythm of the words flows gently through the evening air, describing love, nature, and the mysteries of existence. The audience listens quietly. Even though the political empire of ancient Persia has vanished, the cultural voice of Persia remains strong. Persian identity slowly reshapes itself within this new environment. People continue celebrating traditional festivals such as Nowruz, the Persian New Year, that marks the arrival of spring. Families gather to share meals and decorate homes with symbolic objects representing renewal and life. These traditions connect the present to centuries of earlier history. As night settles over the city, lanterns illuminate the quiet streets. You realize that Persia has not truly disappeared, it has simply transformed. Instead of dominating the region through imperial conquest, Persian culture now spreads through language, scholarship, and art. And in the centuries ahead, that cultural influence will grow even stronger. Because a remarkable intellectual flowering is about to unfold across the Persian world, the morning sun rises gently over the rooftops of Baghdad, casting long golden light across courtyards filled with scholars, students, and travellers. The city hums with quiet intellectual energy. Scrolls and manuscripts pass from hand to hand. Conversations about philosophy and mathematics drift through shaded gardens. You are now living in a time historians often describe as a golden age of knowledge. Across the Persian world and the wider Islamic civilization, learning becomes a central pursuit. Libraries expand, schools appear in major cities. Scholars translate ancient works and produce new discoveries that will influence generations far beyond their own time. The Persian cultural tradition plays a major role in this transformation. A widely recognized historical fact tells us that during the Abbasid period, especially between the 9th and 11th centuries, major translation projects brought Greek scientific and philosophical texts into Arabic and Persian scholarly circles. You walk through one of the famous centers of learning known as the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. The building is filled with quiet activity. Scholars sit cross-legged on carpet studying manuscripts from Greece, India, and Persia. Some translate the works of Aristotle and Plato. Others study mathematical treatises from India. Physicians examine ancient medical texts and compare them with their own observation. The atmosphere feels curious and patient rather than hurried. Knowledge is treated as something precious. Persian scholars contribute greatly to this intellectual movement. One of the most important figures you encounter is a mathematician named Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi. His writings on algebra will later influence mathematics across Europe and Asia. The word algebra itself comes from the title of one of his books. In a quiet room filled with parchment pages, you watch as he demonstrates new ways of solving numerical problems. His methods help organize mathematical thinking into clear procedures that students can follow step by step. Another remarkable thinker appears little later in history. His name is Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna. Avicenna studies medicine, philosophy, and science with extraordinary dedication. His medical encyclopedia, the Canon of Medicine, becomes one of the most influential medical texts for centuries. You imagine standing beside him in a small study room where shelves hold hundreds of carefully copied manuscripts. Patients arrive seeking treatment. Students gather to listen to his explanations about anatomy and disease. His approach combines observation philosophy and earlier medical knowledge from Greek and Persian traditions. Yet the intellectual life of the Persian world is not limited to science and medicine. Poetry becomes one of its most beautiful forms of expression. You travel east to the city of Tus, where a poet named Ferdowsi works quietly on an enormous literary project. He spends decades composing a vast epic poem known as the Shahnameh, or the Book of Kings. This work tells the legendary history of Persian rulers and heroes from mythical times up to the fall of the Sasanian Empire. One fascinating historical detail reveals how significant this poem becomes for Persian identity. The Shahnameh contains more than 50,000 lines of verse, making it one of the longest epic poems ever written by a single author. Ferdowsi writes it in Persian at a time when many scholars are producing works primarily in Arabic. Historians continue discussing whether Ferdowsi intentionally aimed to revive Persian cultural identity through his work, or whether his focusing on Persian themes simply reflected the literary tastes of his era. Regardless of the exact motivation, the impact of the Shahnameh is enormous. You sit among listeners gathered in a quiet garden as a storyteller recites verses from the poem. The audience hears tales of ancient kings, heroic warriors, and dramatic struggles between good and evil. These stories reconnect people with their cultural past. Even though Persia no longer exists as a political empire, its memory lives vividly through literature. Throughout cities across the Persian world, scholars and poets continue shaping an intellectual tradition admired across many regions. Persian becomes one of the most important literary languages from Central Asia to India. Courtly culture in many Islamic kingdoms adopts Persian poetry, storytelling, and artistic styles. The influence spreads gently but widely. As evening falls, lanterns glow softly across the gardens where scholars gather to discuss ideas. Some debate philosophy late into the night. Others compose verses describing the beauty of nature or the mysteries of the human soul. The atmosphere feels calm and thoughtful. The Persian world has become a centre of learning, creativity and cultural expression, yet history never remains still. Political power across these lands will soon shift again as new dynasties rise and fall, but the cultural legacy created during this golden age will continue shaping Persian identity for centuries to come. The morning breeze moves gently through the gardens where poets and scholars once gathered in the cities of the Persian world. The intellectual flowering you witnessed has left a deep mark across many lands. Libraries have expanded, schools have produced generations of thinkers, stories and poems have travelled far beyond the Iranian plateau. But one of the most powerful forces connecting these regions is something quieter: language. You now begin to notice how the Persian language itself spreads across courts, markets and cultural centres far beyond the boundaries of ancient Persia. Even though Arabic remains the dominant language of religion and scholarship in much of the Islamic world, Persian gradually becomes the preferred language of literature, storytelling and courtly culture in many regions. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that by the 10th and 11th centuries, Persian had become the literary and administrative language in several powerful dynasties across Central Asia and parts of the Middle East. You travel to the city of Bukhara, one of the great centres of Persian culture during this period. The streets are filled with traders arriving from distant lands. Caravan bells echo through narrow alleys as merchants unload goods from long journeys across deserts and mountains. In the royal court, officials conduct ceremonies surrounded by poets, musicians and scholars. Many of them speak Persian. Even rulers who are not ethnically Persian often adopt the language for official use. This cultural influence spreads through powerful dynasties such as the Samanids, who rule large parts of Central Asia during the 9th and 10th centuries. The Samanid court actively encourages the use of Persian in literature and administration. As a result, Persian poetry and storytelling flourish. You walk through a quiet courtyard where a young poet carefully composes lines describing gardens, rivers, and the changing seasons. Persian poetry often focuses on themes of love, nature, wisdom, and the passage of time. The rhythm of the language flows smoothly, making it well suited for recitation and performance. One fascinating historical detail reveals how far Persian literary culture travelled during these centuries. By the medieval period, Persian had become the language of courtly culture in parts of the Indian subcontinent, Central Asia, and even regions of Anatolia. Rulers across these areas sponsored Persian poets and historians as symbols of sophistication and learning. Historians continued discussing why Persian achieved such wide influence across diverse political regions. Some scholars believe its poetic richness and flexibility made it especially attractive for literary expression. Others argue that political networks and cultural prestige attached to Persian courts helped spread the language across vast territories. Standing in a lively marketplace, you hear conversations shifting between several languages. Traders speak Turkic dialects, Arabic, and local regional languages. Yet when official announcements are read in the city square, the words are often spoken in Persian. The language becomes something like a cultural bridge connecting many different peoples. This influence extends into art and architecture as well. You visit a royal garden where musicians play instruments beside fountains and flowering trees. The design of the garden reflects a Persian aesthetic tradition, emphasizing harmony between nature and architecture. Water channels divide the garden into symmetrical sections, creating a sense of calm order. These garden designs will later inspire famous landscapes across regions influenced by Persian culture. In the court library, scribes copy beautifully illustrated manuscripts. Miniature paintings accompany many literary works depicting scenes from epic stories or moments of romantic poetry. The art style blends Persian traditions with influences from other cultures encountered along trade routes. At some night, storytellers gather beneath lantern light to recite famous works. Among the most beloved stories are those drawn from the Shahnameh, the epic history of Persian kings and heroes. Listeners hear tales of ancient warriors, wise rulers, and mythical creatures. These stories remind people that their cultural heritage stretches back thousands of years. Even though political control over Persia has passed through many different dynasties, the language and literature keep the memory of that past alive. Persian identity continues evolving. It is no longer tied solely to imperial power. Instead, it survives through culture, storytelling, and shared traditions. But while Persian culture spreads peacefully through poetry and scholarship, the political world surrounding it is about to experience another dramatic transformation. From the vast grasslands of Central Asia, new conquerors are preparing to move westward. There are rival the cities and kingdoms that have flourished during this cultural golden age, and the Persian world will once again face the challenge of adapting to powerful new rulers. The calm rhythm of poetry and scholarship continues across the Persian world, yet far beyond the peaceful gardens and libraries, the political landscape begins shifting once again. Empires and dynasties rise and fall across the vast land stretching from Central Asia to the Middle East. You travel northward toward the great steppes where endless grasslands roll beneath wide skies. Here life moves differently than in the settled cities of Persia. Nomadic tribes guide their herds across open plains following seasonal routes that stretch across thousands of kilometers. From these grasslands come powerful waves of migration and conquest. Throughout the centuries after the Islamic expansion, several new ruling dynasties appear across the Persian world. Many of them originate from Turkic peoples who move gradually into the region from Central Asia. Yet something interesting happens when these new rulers take control of Persian lands. Rather than replacing Persian culture, many of them adopt it. A widely recognized historical fact tells us that several Turkic dynasties, including the Ghaznavids and later the Seljuks, ruled large parts of the Persian world, while actively supporting Persian language and culture within their courts. You arrive in the city of Ghazni during the rule of Mahmud of Ghazni in the early 11th century. The city is busy with travellers and merchants arriving from across Asia. Royal palaces rise above the streets where scholars and poets gather. Mahmud himself commands a powerful military and leads campaigns across neighbouring regions. But within his court, Persian poets and historians hold respected positions. One fascinating historical detail from this period reveals how Persian culture flourished even under rulers of different ethnic origins. Many Turkic leaders saw Persian literature and administrative traditions as symbols of prestige and effective governance. As a result, they actively sponsored Persian scholars and artists. Historians continued discussing whether this cultural adoption was purely practical, or whether these rulers genuinely admired Persian traditions. Some scholars argue that Persian culture offered an established model of royal authority that new dynasties could use to legitimize their power. Others suggest that cultural exchange simply evolved naturally within these diverse societies. As you walk through the palace gardens of Ghazni, musicians perform beside fountains while poets recite verses celebrating both the ruler and the beauty of the surrounding world. The language of these poems is Persian. This pattern continues with the rise of another powerful dynasty, the Seljuk Turks. In the 11th century, Seljuk rulers expand their influence across much of the Middle East and Persia. Their armies move swiftly across deserts and mountains, establishing a new political order. Yet once again, Persian culture remains central within their administration. You visit the Seljuk capital where scholars gather in newly established schools known as madrasas. These institutions teach theology, philosophy, law, and science. Students travel from distant regions to study under respected teachers. Persian becomes the language of literature and courtly communication in many of these centers. At the same time, cities across the Persian world continue developing vibrant artistic traditions. Architects construct mosques and schools decorated with intricate geometric patterns and colourful tilework. Khalid calligraphers produce elegant manuscripts combining poetry with detailed miniature paintings. The Persian aesthetic sense of balance and beauty appears everywhere. Markets remain busy with traders connecting the Silk Road routes between China, India, and the Mediterranean. Standing in one of these markets, you see goods from many lands. Chinese silk hangs beside Persian carpets. Indian spices fill the air with fragrance. Glassware from the Mediterranean reflects sunlight across the stalls. Despite political changes, the Persian world continues functioning as a cultural and economic crossroads. But beyond the mountains of Central Asia, another force is beginning to gather. This new power moves across the steppe with remarkable speed. Its warriors are disciplined riders accustomed to long journeys across open grasslands. Their leader will soon become one of the most famous conquerors in history. His name will be known across continents, Genghis Khan. As the sun sets behind distant hills, The caravan roads remain busy with travelers who know little about the storm that is quietly forming beyond the horizon. The Persian world has survived many political transformations, yet the arrival of the Mongol Empire will bring challenges unlike anything the region has faced before. The air grows colder as you travel north toward the vast grasslands of Central Asia. The landscape stretches endlessly beneath a pale sky where wind moves across the steppe like an invisible tide. Herds of horses graze across distant hills, and riders appear on the horizon like small moving shadows. Here, far from the libraries and gardens of Persian cities, a new power is rising. For generations, nomadic tribes have lived across these steppes, moving with the seasons and following the needs of their animals. Their lives are shaped by open land, long journeys, and a deep knowledge of horseback riding. Among these tribes, one man begins to unite the scattered clans. His name is Temujin. History will remember him as Genghis Khan. A widely recognized historical fact tells us that in 1206, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler, by an assembly of Mongol tribal leaders after successfully uniting many of the nomadic groups of the Mongolian steppe. This moment marks the beginning of one of the largest empires ever created. Standing beside a group of mounted warriors, you watch them practice their remarkable skills. Their horses move swiftly across the grasslands while the riders guide them with effortless precision. Each warrior carries a composite bow capable of firing arrows across impressive distances. These bows are carefully crafted from wood, horn, and sinew, allowing great power despite their relatively small size. Mounted archery becomes the foundation of Mongol warfare. The riders can shoot accurately while galloping, retreating, or circling their enemies. Their mobility allows them to travel vast distances quickly and strike unexpectedly. One unusual historical detail about the Mongol army reveals how disciplined their organization truly was. Soldiers were arranged into units based on a decimal system. Groups of 10 formed the smallest unit, which combined into larger groups of 100, 1,000, and eventually 10,000. This structure allowed Mongol commanders to coordinate complex battlefield movements with remarkable efficiency. Historians continue discussing how the Mongols managed to conquer such enormous territories so quickly. Some scholars emphasize their superior mobility and battlefield tactics. Others point to their use of intelligent networks and psychological strategies designed to intimidate enemies before battles even began. Whatever the exact reasons, the expansion begins with extraordinary speed. The Mongol armies sweep across Central Asia, conquering cities and territories that had once been part of earlier Persian and Turkic dynasties. Eventually their attention turns toward the lands of Persia itself. You travel southward toward the Iranian plateau once more. Seas that once flourished with trade and scholarship now face the approaching Mongol forces. The first encounters are devastating. Mongol armies move swiftly from city to city. Some towns resist and suffer terrible destruction. Others surrender quickly in hopes of avoiding the same fate. You arrive at the gates of one Persian city where leaders gather anxiously to decide how to respond. Should they resist or negotiate surrender? Such decisions weigh heavily on the minds of local rulers. The Mongol advance continues across the region during the early 13th century. One particularly dramatic moment occurs when the Mongols confront the Khwarezmian Empire, which had controlled large areas of Persia and Central Asia. A conflict between Mongol envoys and the Khwarezmian ruler escalates into open war. Genghis Khan launches a massive campaign across the region. Cities including Bukhari and Samarkand fall to Mongol armies. You walk through the ruins of a once thriving marketplace where traders once gathered from across Asia. Now the streets are quiet. The impact of the Mongol invasions becomes one of the most dramatic turning points in the history of the Persian world. Yet historians continue discussing the long-term effects of this conquest. Some researchers emphasize the destruction of many cities and irrigation systems during the early stages of the Mongol campaigns. Others note that later Mongol rulers eventually helped restore trade networks and political stability across much of Eurasia. Standing on a hill overlooking the Iranian plateau, you watch as Mongol riders move across the horizon. Their banners ripple in the wind. The political order that had existed for centuries across Persia is collapsing once again. Yet the story does not end with destruction, because after the initial shock of conquest, something unexpected will begin to happen. The Mongol rulers themselves will slowly adapt to the cultures of the lands they conquer. And once again, Persian culture will prove remarkably resilient. The dust of conquest slowly settles across the Persian landscape. The first Mongol invasions brought destruction to many cities and towns. Irrigation canals were damaged, trade routes were disrupted. Communities that had once flourished under earlier dynasties faced a long period of uncertainty. Yet history rarely remains frozen in moments of devastation. As years pass, the Mongol rulers begin transforming from conquering warriors into administrators of a vast new empire. You now travel through the lands of Persia during the later 13th century. The Mongol Empire is divided into several regional states, and one of these governs the Persian world. It is known as the Ilkhanate. The Ilkhan rulers descend from the family of Genghis Khan and control large territories stretching across Iran, parts of Iraq and surrounding regions. At first, the Mongol court feels very different from the Persian royal traditions you encountered earlier in your journey. Nomadic customs remain strong. Many Mongol nobles continue living in portable felt tents known as yurts, even when stationed near cities. Horses remain central to their identity and military organization. But slowly something begins to change. A widely recognized historical fact tells us that several Mongol rulers of the Ilkhanate eventually adopted aspects of Persian culture and administration as they settled into governing the region. You walk through the growing capital city of Tabriz, where this transformation becomes visible. Markets bustle once again, with traders arriving from distant lands. Silk Road routes reopen as political stability gradually returns. Persian craftsmen rebuild workshops that produce metalwork, textiles, and ceramics admired across Eurasia. The Mongol rulers begin relying on experienced Persian administrators to help manage their territories. These officials understand the complex irrigation systems, tax structures, and trade networks that keep the region functioning. Over time, Persian bureaucratic traditions shape the government of the Ilkhanate. One fascinating historical detail from this era involves the Mongol ruler Ghazan Khan. In 1295, Ghazan converts to Islam and begins promoting policies that align the Ilkhanate more closely with the Islamic cultural world surrounding Persia. His decision marks a major turning point in the relationship between Mongol rulers and the Persian population. Historians continue discussing the motivations behind Ghazan's conversion. Some scholars believe it reflected genuine personal conviction. Others suggest the decision may have been partly political, helping him strengthen legitimacy among the predominantly Muslim population he ruled. Regardless of the reason, the cultural shift is significant. Under Ghazan and his successors, Persian culture experiences a remarkable revival. You walk through the construction site of a large complex being built under the direction of Ghazan's chief minister, a scholar named Rashid al-Din. This project includes libraries, hospitals, schools, and observatories. The minister himself writes an ambitious historical work known as the Jami al-Tawarikh, or Compendium of Chronicles, which attempts to record the histories of many civilizations across Eurasia. This reflects another interesting feature of the Mongol period. The Mongol Empire connects regions from China to Europe more closely than ever before. Travelers, merchants, and scholars move across these vast distances carrying ideas and knowledge with them. Standing in a busy caravanserai where travelers rest during long journeys, you hear conversations in many languages. Chinese traders discuss silk shipments. Persian merchants negotiate prices for carpets and spices. Envoys from distant courts share news of political developments far away. The Silk Road network experiences a renewed period of activity during this time. Yet historians remain divided about how prosperous this era truly was for the Persian population. Some researchers emphasize the recovery of trade and the patronage of arts and learning under Mongol rule. Others argue that many rural communities struggled for decades to rebuild after the earlier destruction. Both perspectives likely reflect different experiences across various regions. As evening falls, you wander through the gardens surrounding the Ilkhan court. Persian poets once again recite verses beneath the shade of trees. Artists produce miniature paintings illustrating historical stories and epic poems. The cultural voice of Persia proves remarkably resilient. Even after waves of conquest and political change, Persian language, literature, and artistic traditions continue shaping the identity of the region. But the Mongol political order will not last forever. In the centuries ahead, new dynasties will rise from within the Persian world itself. and once again the idea of a distinctly Iranian state will begin to take form. The long transformation from Persia toward what will eventually become Iran is still unfolding. The caravan roads remain busy as you travel across the Persian lands in the centuries after Mongol rule begins to fade. Cities that once stood under the authority of the Ilkhan rulers gradually return to local dynasties and regional powers. Markets reopen fully. Gardens bloom once more in courtyards where poets and scholars gather. Yet the political landscape across the Persian world remains fragmented. Small kingdoms and competing rulers control different territories. Tribal leaders assert influence in mountain regions. Trade continues, but the sense of unified authority across the plateau feels uncertain. Then, in the early 16th century, something remarkable begins to unfold. A new dynasty rises from the northwest of Persia. Their movement is not only political, it is also deeply religious. You arrive in the rugged lands of Azerbaijan, where a charismatic young leader gathers followers beneath red banners. His supporters wear a distinctive headgear with 12 folds symbolizing devotion to the 12 Shia imams. His name is Ismail. A widely recognized historical fact tells us that Shah Ismail I founded the Safavid dynasty in 1501 and declared Twelver Shia Islam as the official religion of the Persian state. At the time, this decision will reshape the identity of the region for centuries to come. But standing among the early Safavid supporters, the movement feels less like an established empire and more like a passionate revolution. Ismail is only a teenager when he leads his forces into battle, yet his followers believe he carries spiritual authority and divine favour. They are known as the Kizilbash, meaning redheads, referring to their distinctive red headgear. You watch as these warriors gather beneath fluttering banners before a decisive campaign. Their energy is intense. Many see their leader not only as a king but also as a sacred figure connected to divine guidance. The Safavid armies move swiftly across the region. Cities fall one after another. Eventually Ismail enters the historic city of Tabriz and proclaims himself Shah of Persia. For the first time in many centuries, a powerful state centered on the Iranian plateau emerges once again. Yet the Safavid revolution introduces a new defining feature: religion. While earlier Persian empires included many religious traditions, the Safavid rulers actively promote Twelver Shia Islam as the official faith of the state. One fascinating historical detail from this transformation involves the importation of Shia scholars from regions such as Lebanon and Iraq. At the time, much of the Persian population had previously followed Sunni traditions or local practices. To strengthen the new religious identity of the state's Safavid rulers, invited scholars who could teach Shia theology and establish religious institutions. Historians continue discussing how quickly and thoroughly this religious shift occurred. Some scholars believe the transformation happened gradually over generations through education and social change. Others argue that Safavid authorities used stronger political pressure in certain regions to encourage conversion. Whatever the precise process, the long-term result is clear. Persia becomes the center of a Shia Islam. You walk through the city of Isfahan during the height of Safavid power. The city has grown into one of the most beautiful capitals of the early modern world. Wide boulevards connect grand squares surrounded by mosques, palaces, and bustling markets. The architecture is breathtaking. Blue and turquoise tiles cover mosque domes that shimmer under the sunlight. Intricate geometric patterns decorate walls and archways. Water channels flow through carefully designed gardens. In the great square known as Naksh-i-Jahan, merchants sell carpets, spices and textiles while musicians perform near fountains. Persian culture flourishes once again. Poetry continues thriving. Miniature painting reaches new artistic heights. Persian carpets woven during this era become famous across the world. Yet the Safavid Empire also faces powerful rivals. To their west stands the Ottoman Empire, a Sunni Muslim state controlling much of the Middle East and southeastern Europe. To the east lie Central Asian powers competing for influence. The Safavid rulers must constantly defend their territory while building their new state. Despite these challenges, the Safavid period leaves a lasting mark on Persian identity. For the first time since the fall of the ancient empires, a unified Persian state emerges with a distinct religious and cultural identity. The foundations of modern Iran begin taking shape. As evening falls across the gardens of Isfahan, lanterns glow softly along quiet walkways. The city reflects the confidence of a civilization that has survived centuries of conquest and transformation. Persia has been reborn once again, and the story of how this land will eventually become known as Iran continues to unfold. The morning sun reflects softly from the blue-tiled domes of Isfahan as you walk through the wide avenues of the Safavid capital. Water flows quietly through stone channels lining the streets, and the scent of fresh bread drifts from nearby bakeries. Merchants slowly open their shops while travellers gather in caravanserais after long journeys. The Safavid Empire now stands as a powerful and confident state, yet one decision made by its rulers continues shaping every aspect of life across the Persian world: the adoption of 12 Shia Islam as the official faith. You step into one of the magnificent mosques surrounding the great square of Isfahan. Sunlight filters through the entrance arch, illuminating intricate calligraphy written across the walls. Worshippers move quietly through the courtyard, preparing for prayer. For centuries before the Safavid era, most Muslims across Persia had followed Sunni traditions similar to those practiced in many other parts of the Islamic world. But the Safavid rulers introduce a dramatic change. A widely recognized historical fact tells us that the Safavids actively promoted 12 Shia Islam throughout their territories, helping transform Persia into the most important center of Shia religious life. This transformation does not happen overnight. When Shah Ismail first declares Shia Islam the state religion in 1501, many regions of Persia still follow Sunni traditions or local interpretations of Islam. To strengthen the new religious identity, Safavid rulers begin building networks of religious schools and inviting Shia scholars from outside the region. These scholars teach theology, law, and philosophy, while helping establish new religious institutions across Persian cities. You sit quietly inside a madrasa courtyard where students listen attentively to a teacher explaining the teachings of the 12 imams. The 12 imams are central figures in 12 Shia belief, seen as spiritual leaders descended from the family of the Prophet Muhammad. The 12th imam is believed to have entered a state of hidden existence and will one day return as a figure of justice. This belief becomes deeply embedded in Persian religious culture. One fascinating historical detail reveals how Safavid rulers encouraged public expressions of Shia identity. During certain religious commemorations, communities began performing dramatic mourning ceremonies remembering the martyrdom of Imam Hussein at the Battle of Karbala in the 7th century. These ceremonies include processions, recitations of historical narratives, and emotional expressions of grief that strengthen communal identity. Historians continue discussing how these rituals evolved during the Safavid period. Some researchers believe Safavid authorities actively promoted them to reinforce political unity. Others argue that many of these practices developed organically among communities and later gained royal support. As you walk through the streets during one of these commemorations, the atmosphere feels solemn yet powerful. Groups of people move slowly through the city carrying banners and reciting prayers. Musicians play rhythmic drums that echo through the narrow alleys. The ceremony connects the community to a shared sense of historical memory and spiritual devotion. Beyond religion, the Safavid rulers also strengthen the cultural identity of Persia. Persian language remains the dominant language of literature and administration. Poets continue composing verses that celebrate love, nature, and philosophical reflection. Artists create intricate miniature paintings illustrating scenes from epic stories like the Shahnameh. The Persian aesthetic sense of beauty and balance appears everywhere. Gardens are carefully designed to symbolize paradise with flowing water, channels dividing green spaces into harmonious sections. You sit beside a quiet pool in one of these gardens where cypress trees cast long shadows across the ground. The gentle sound of water flowing through the garden channels creates a peaceful atmosphere. The Safavid period represents one of the most important stages in the long transformation of Persia. Not only does the empire restore political unity across the Iranian plateau, but it also shapes a distinct religious identity that will remain central to the region for centuries. Yet the Safavid state also faces serious challenges. Powerful neighbouring empires watch carefully. The Ottoman Empire to the west views the rise of a Shia Persian state with deep suspicion. military confrontations between the two powers become frequent along their shared borders. Historians still discuss how deeply religious differences influence these conflicts compared with traditional political rivalries over territory and influence. As evening approaches in Isfahan, the city begins to quiet. Lanterns glow softly along the grand square while the last merchants close their shops. You realize that the Safavid era has permanently reshaped the identity of Persia. Religion, culture, and a political power have combined to create something new. The land once known simply as Persia is beginning to take on the deeper identity that will eventually be called Iran. But the Safavid Empire itself will not last forever. In the centuries ahead, internal weaknesses and external pressures will once again test the strength of this ancient land. The evening breeze moves softly through the gardens of Isfahan as the Safavid Empire reaches the height of its beauty and influence. Lantern light reflects across tiled walls and quiet fountains, while musicians play gentle melodies in palace courtyards. From the outside, the empire appears confident and stable. Its capital dazzles visitors with architecture, scholarship, and vibrant markets. Persian carpets travel across the world, silk routes remain active. Diplomats arrive from Europe, Central Asia, and the Ottoman lands. Yet when you travel beyond the elegant avenues of the capital, the geopolitical reality of Persia becomes clearer. The Safavid state sits between powerful rivals. To the west lies the Ottoman Empire, one of the largest and most formidable states of the early modern world. Ottoman armies control Anatolia, much of the Middle East and southeastern Europe. To the north, the Russian state is gradually expanding southward across the Caucasus. To the east, Central Asian khanates compete for influence along frontier regions. Persia now lives at the crossroads of several expanding powers. A widely recognized historical fact tells us that the Safavid and Ottoman empires fought numerous wars during the 16th and 17th centuries, largely centered around control of eastern Anatolia, the Caucasus, and parts of Mesopotamia. You arrive at a frontier fortress where Persian soldiers guard the borderlands. The stone walls overlook rugged mountain terrain that has seen many armies march through over the centuries. Watchtowers stand above narrow passes where scouts keep careful watch for approaching forces. The rivalry between Persia and the Ottoman Empire is shaped by both politics and religion. The Ottomans follow Sunni Islam while the Safavid state champions Twelver Shia belief. But historians continue discussing how much of the conflict truly revolved around religious differences. Some scholars believe the sectarian divide intensified hostility between the two empires. Others argue that the wars largely reflected traditional struggles over territory, trade routes, and strategic influence. Standing beside soldiers along the frontier, you sense how complex the rivalry truly is. Caravans still cross the border carrying goods and travelers between the two worlds. Diplomats sometimes negotiate peace agreements, yet armies remain prepared for sudden conflict. Further north, the geopolitical landscape is also shifting. You travel toward the Caucasus region where Persian influence overlaps with the growing ambitions of Russia. During earlier centuries, these mountainous territories had often been loosely connected to Persian political authority. But as Russia expands southward, the balance of power begins slowly changing. One fascinating historical detail from this era involves the movement of people across the Safavid Empire. The Safavid rulers sometimes relocated entire communities, including artisans and merchants, from one region to another in order to strengthen certain cities or support economic development. For example, Armenian merchant communities were moved to the Safavid capital, where they became important participants in international trade networks linking Persia with Europe and India. Historians continue discussing how voluntary or forced these relocations were in different cases. Some scholars believe they helped create thriving commercial centers. Others emphasize the hardships experienced by communities required to leave their ancestral homes. Walking through the Armenian quarter of Isfahan, known as New Julfa, you see evidence of this cultural diversity. Churches stand beside Persian-style homes decorated with painted interiors. Merchants speak several languages while negotiating with traders from Europe and Asia. The Safavid Empire has become a meeting place of many cultures. Persian identity continues developing within this diverse environment. Language, literature, religion, and artistic traditions combine to create a society both deeply rooted in its past and connected to the wider world. Yet the stability of the Safavid system depends heavily on the strength of its rulers. When capable kings govern the empire, prosperity and cultural achievement flourish. But when leadership weakens, political tensions quickly emerge. As you walk through the quiet corridors of a royal palace late at night, you begin to hear whispers among courtiers and officials. Concerns about succession. Concerns about the loyalty of provincial leaders. Concerns about the strength of the army. These murmurs suggest that beneath the elegance of Safavid Persia, cracks are beginning to form. Empires rarely collapse suddenly. More often they slowly weaken through a combination of internal problems and external pressures. The Safavid Empire will soon face exactly such a test, and the outcome will once again reshape the political future of the Persian world. The quiet elegance of Safavid Persia slowly begins to change as the years pass. The great squares of Isfahan still shine beneath the sunlight, and the tiled domes of mosques continue reflecting shades of blue and turquoise across the sky. Yet the confident energy that once filled the empire begins to fade. You walk through the same avenues that earlier felt vibrant with trade and diplomacy. Now the conversations among merchants and travellers carry subtle notes of concern. Empires often decline gradually rather than through a single dramatic event. Political structures weaken little by little. Leadership becomes uncertain. Economic networks begin losing their strength. The Safavid Empire enters exactly such a period. A widely recognized historical fact tells us that during the late 17th and early 18th centuries, Safavid political authority weakened significantly due to internal instability, economic challenges, and difficulties maintaining control over distant provinces. You arrive in the royal palace where the court once hosted brilliant ceremonies and gatherings of poets and scholars. The halls still contain beautiful decorations, but the atmosphere feels different. Some later Safavid rulers lack the strong leadership of their earlier predecessors. Court politics becomes increasingly complicated as powerful factions compete for influence around the throne. Meanwhile, regional governors begin exercising greater independence from central authority. Travelling through the countryside, you see signs of this weakening control. Some provincial leaders collect taxes for themselves rather than sending full revenues to the capital. Military forces in distant regions become less reliable. The empire's ability to respond quickly to external threats begins to decline. One fascinating historical detail from this era involves the Safavid military system. Earlier, Safavid rulers had relied heavily on the Kizilbash tribal warriors who helped establish the dynasty. Over time, however, the balance of military power shifted as new standing armies and slave soldier units known as gulams were introduced. Historians continue discussing whether these military changes strengthened or weakened the Safavid state in the long term. Some scholars argue that the reforms improved discipline and centralized authority. Others suggest that tensions between different military groups created instability within the empire. As these internal issues unfold, new dangers begin appearing along the empire's frontiers. In the east, tribal confederations in Afghanistan grow increasingly restless. You travel toward the eastern regions where Persian authority has long depended on alliances with local leaders. But tensions between Safavid officials and Afghan tribal groups gradually escalate. Eventually a rebellion breaks out under a leader named Mir Mahmud Hotak. His forces begin moving westward toward the Persian heartland. Standing on a hill overlooking a caravan road, you watch anxious travellers discussing the growing unrest. Few at first believe the rebellion could threaten the Safavid capital itself, but the situation escalates quickly. In 1722, Afghan forces march toward Isfahan. You stand near the city walls as defenders prepare for the approaching siege. The once proud capital now faces a desperate struggle. Supplies grow scarce. The population suffers through months of hardship as the siege continues. Eventually, the Safavid ruler Shah Sultan Hussein surrenders the city. The fall of Isfahan marks the effective collapse of the Safavid Empire. Historians continue debating the deep causes of this dramatic downfall. Some researchers emphasize internal political weakness and ineffective leadership. Others highlight the economic strain created by shifting trade routes and international competition. Still others focus on the growing independence of frontier regions. Most scholars agree that multiple factors combine to produce the final collapse. Walking through the quiet streets of Isfahan after the surrender, you feel the weight of centuries of history. This city once represented the confidence and cultural brilliance of Safavid Persia. Now its political power has faded. Yet once again, the story of the Persian world does not end with the fall of a dynasty. New leaders soon begin emerging from within the region. One of them will rise from humble origins to drive out the Afghan occupiers and attempt to rebuild Persian power. His name will be Nader, and for a brief moment the Persian world will again witness the rise of a powerful conqueror. The long journey from ancient Persia toward the modern nation of Iran continues. The morning light spreads across the plain surrounding Isfahan, illuminating a land still recovering from the collapse of Safavid rule. The once magnificent capital remains scarred by siege and political upheaval. Markets reopen slowly. Farmers return cautiously to their fields. The Persian world has entered another period of uncertainty, yet history rarely leaves such spaces empty for long. In times of chaos, new leaders often emerge. You travel eastward through the rugged lands of northeastern Persia, where a young military commander begins attracting attention among tribal warriors and local leaders. His name is Nader. He comes from modest origins within a Turkic-speaking tribal group known as the Afshars. Unlike the aristocratic families that once dominated Safavid politics, Nader rises through skill in warfare and strategic thinking. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that Reza Shah successfully expelled Afghan forces from Persia and crowned himself ruler in 1736, establishing the Afsharid dynasty. At first, Nader fights in the name of restoring Safavid authority. He gathers loyal forces and begins pushing back against Afghan control across Persian territories. His campaigns move rapidly through regions that had fallen into disorder. You watch his army assembling on a dusty plain. Unlike the ceremonial armies of earlier dynasties, Nader's soldiers focus on discipline and mobility. Cavalry units train constantly. Commanders coordinate movements carefully across the battlefield. Gradually, victory follows victory. Afghan forces are driven out of the Persian heartland. Cities once lost to rebellion return to Persian control. Nader's reputation grows with each campaign. Eventually he moves beyond simple restoration of the Safavid throne. In 1736 he declares himself Shah of Persia. The empire now enters a new phase. Under Nader Shah, Persia briefly becomes one of the most powerful military forces of its era. His armies march not only within Persia but also far beyond its traditional borders. One of his most famous campaigns takes him eastward towards the rich lands of the Indian subcontinent. You travel with the army across the mountains toward northern India, where the Mughal Empire, once a powerful state, has begun showing signs of weakness. In 1739, Nader Shah defeats Mughal forces near the city of Delhi. The Persian army enters the magnificent Mughal capital. Historians still discuss the dramatic events that followed. Some accounts describe intense chaos within the city during the Persian occupation. Others focus on the enormous wealth taken from the Mughal treasury, including jewels, gold, and the famous peacock throne. One fascinating historical detail from this moment involves a legendary diamond. Among the treasures carried away by Nader Shah is believed to have been the Koh-i-Noor, a gemstone that would later pass through several royal collections before eventually becoming part of the British crown jewels. Scholars continue debating the exact path of this famous diamond through history, but its association with Nader Shah's campaign reflects the enormous scale of wealth involved. As you walk through the Persian camp after the campaign soldiers celebrate their victory, while scribes record inventories of the captured treasures, for a moment Persia appears powerful once again. Yet Nader Shah's rule also carries darker consequences. His relentless military campaigns place heavy burdens on the population. Taxes rise to support the army. Political tensions grow within the empire. Historians remain divided about how to evaluate his reign. Some scholars describe Nader Shah as one of the greatest military commanders of Persian history, capable of restoring strength during a moment of crisis. Others argue that his harsh rule and constant warfare ultimately weakened the long-term stability of the state. Toward the end of his life, his leadership becomes increasingly severe. Suspicions of conspiracy spread through the court. Loyal commanders grow uneasy. The atmosphere of fear begins affecting the empire's internal stability. Eventually, in 1747, Nader Shah is assassinated by members of his own circle. With his death, the fragile empire he built quickly fragments. Once again, Persia returns to a period of political division. Yet the memory of Persian unity never fully disappears. Local dynasties continue competing for control across the Iranian plateau. And in the following century, a new ruler will attempt to rebuild a centralized state that more closely resembles the Persia of earlier times. The long transformation from ancient Persia toward the modern nation of Iran moves another step forward. The years following the death of Reza Shah bring another period of uncertainty across the Persian lands. The powerful empire he briefly assembled breaks apart almost immediately after his assassination. Rival commanders claim authority in different regions. Tribal leaders assert control over mountain territories. Trade routes continue operating, but the political structure of the country becomes fragmented once again. You travel through the countryside where local governors now manage cities largely on their own. In some places, stability returns under smaller dynasties. In others, power struggles continue for years. Eventually, a new ruling family begins consolidating control. This dynasty becomes known as the Qajar dynasty. A widely recognized historical fact tells us that the Qajar rulers established their authority over most of Persia in the late 18th century and governed the country until the early 20th century. You arrive in Tehran during the early years of Qajar rule. At this time, the city is still developing into a major capital. Markets expand along narrow streets. Artisans construct new buildings while royal officials establish administrative offices. Tehran will soon become the center of political power for the country. Yet the world surrounding Persia has changed dramatically since the days of the Safavid Empire. New global powers are emerging. European empires expand their influence across Asia. Russia grows stronger to the north. Britain strengthens its presence in India to the southeast. Persia now stands between powerful foreign interests competing for influence in the region. Historians often describe this geopolitical competition as the Great Game. The phrase refers to the strategic rivalry between the Russian Empire and the British Empire, as both powers sought influence across Central Asia and surrounding regions during the 19th century. Persia becomes one of the important arenas in this contest. You walk through the royal court where diplomats from different countries arrive to negotiate treaties and trade agreements. Russian envoys discuss borders in the Caucasus. British representatives negotiate commercial privileges and political alliances. The Persian rulers attempt to balance these pressures while preserving their independence. Yet this task proves extremely difficult. One fascinating historical detail from this period involves the treaties Persia signed with Russia after a series of military conflicts in the early 19th century. Following the Russo-Persian Wars, Persia lost significant territories in the Caucasus region through treaties such as the Treaty of Gulistan in 1813 and the Treaty of Turkmenchai in 1828. These agreements transferred lands that today include parts of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan to Russian control. Historians continue debating the long-term consequences of these territorial losses. Some scholars view them as moments when Persia's political influence declined sharply under pressure from modern European military powers. Others emphasize that internal political weaknesses made resistance to such expansion more difficult. Walking along the bustling streets of Tehran, you see a society adjusting to a rapidly changing world. European goods begin appearing in markets alongside traditional Persian crafts. Foreign advisors occasionally appear in government projects. Students travel abroad to learn new scientific and technical skills. At the same time, Persian cultural traditions remain deeply rooted. Poetry continues flourishing. Religious institutions play important roles in community life. Persian language and identity remain strong across cities and villages. But many people begin questioning the political structure of the state. Some intellectuals and reformers argue that the country needs modernization in order to resist foreign influence. They discuss new ideas about constitutional government, economic reform, and education. These debates slowly grow louder during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Eventually, they lead to one of the most important political transformations in modern Persian history, the Constitutional Revolution of 1906. You stand among crowds gathered in Tehran as demonstrators call for the creation of a national parliament and limits on royal authority. Merchants, clerics, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens join the movement demanding reform. The revolution leads to the establishment of the Majlis, a national assembly intended to represent the people and help guide the country's future. Historians remain divided about how successful this early constitutional experiment truly was. Some scholars view it as a bold step toward the modern political participation. Others emphasize the continued influence of royal authority and foreign powers that limited its effectiveness. Still, the revolution marks a turning point. Persia is beginning to imagine itself as a modern nation rather than simply the territory of an ancient empire. And within a few decades, a powerful new leader will rise who believes he can reshape the country completely. His reforms will eventually lead to one of the most symbolic decisions in the long story of this land. The moment when Persia officially becomes known to the world as Iran. The early 20th century brings a new atmosphere to the cities of Persia. Streets in Tehran grow busier each year as new buildings rise beside older markets and mosques. Telegraph wires stretch across neighborhoods. Foreign merchants open offices. Carriages share the roads, with the first motor vehicles slowly appearing in the capital. The country is changing. The constitutional revolution has already shaken the traditional balance of power between the monarchy and the people. A national parliament now exists, and political debates echo through newspapers and public gatherings. Yet the nation still faces enormous challenges. Foreign influence remains strong. Economic resources are limited. Political factions compete for control of the government. Into this uncertain environment steps a determined military officer. His name is Reza Khan. A widely recognized historical fact tells us that Reza Khan rose to power after a military coup in 1921 and later became Reza Shah Pahlavi, founding the Pahlavi dynasty that would rule the country until the late 20th century. You stand among soldiers gathered in a Tehran barracks during those early years. Reza Khan commands respect through discipline and confidence. His vision is clear. He believes the country must modernize rapidly in order to survive in a world dominated by powerful industrial nations. After gradually consolidating power, he becomes prime minister and eventually crowns himself Shah in 1925. Under his leadership, sweeping reforms begin transforming the country. You walk along a newly constructed road outside Tehran, where workers build infrastructure designed to connect distant regions of the nation. Railways stretch across deserts and mountains. Schools open in cities and rural towns. A national army replaces older tribal military systems. The changes come quickly. Reza Shah encourages industrial development and seeks to strengthen the central authority of the state. He also promotes a stronger sense of national identity rooted in the long history of the Persian world. One fascinating historical detail from this period involves the revival of interest in pre-Islamic Persian history. Archaeological projects explore the ruins of ancient cities such as Persepolis. Scholars publish studies celebrating the achievements of the Achaemenid and Sasanian empires. Public ceremonies begin honoring figures like Cyrus the Great as symbols of national pride. Historians continue discussing how much these efforts represented genuine historical curiosity versus political symbolism designed to strengthen national unity. Some scholars believe the revival of ancient Persian imagery helped create a powerful sense of cultural continuity. Others argue that the emphasis on ancient heritage was also used strategically to support modernization policies. Amid these reforms, one decision made by Reza Shah carries lasting symbolic significance. For centuries, the country had been widely known in the West as Persia. Yet within the land itself, people often refer to their homeland using a different word, Iran. The term comes from the ancient expression Aryanam, meaning the land of the Aryans, referring to the early Iranian peoples who had lived on the plateau thousands of years earlier. In 1935, Reza Shah officially requested that foreign governments refer to the country by the name Iran in diplomatic communication. The decision marks an important moment in the long transformation you've been following throughout this journey. One fascinating aspect of this change is how differently it was received in various parts of the world. Inside the country, many people were already familiar with the name Iran and saw the change as a natural expression of national identity. However, some scholars and observers abroad initially felt nostalgic about the name Persia, which had been associated with centuries of literature, art, and historical memory. Historians still discuss whether the shift from Persia to Iran represented a simple correction of terminology or a deeper statement about modern national identity. Standing in a government office where the new name appears on official documents, you sense the symbolic weight of the moment. The ancient land of Cyrus Darius and the Safavid kings now presents itself to the world under a name rooted in even older traditions. Persia has not vanished. Instead, the name Iran connects the modern nation with the long heritage of the Iranian peoples. Outside the building, the city of Tehran continues moving forward. Students attend newly built schools, workers travel along expanding railways, newspapers discuss politics, culture, and the future of the nation. The transformation from empire to modern state is far from complete, but the name Iran now carries the story of thousands of years within it. And the challenges of modern history are only just beginning. The streets of Tehran continue growing busier as the 20th century unfolds. Cars now move steadily along avenues where only horses and carriages once travelled. Schools, government offices, and military academies expand across the capital. The country that the outside world now officially calls Iran is entering a new and complicated chapter of its long story. You walk through the city during the later years of Reza Shah's rule. Construction projects transform the landscape. New railways connect distant regions across the Iranian plateau. Government ministries operate from modern buildings designed to symbolize national strength. The reforms introduced during this period aim to create a centralized and modern state. A widely recognized historical fact tells us that Reza Shah pursued policies intended to strengthen national independence by reducing foreign influence and expanding Iran's infrastructure, education system, and national army. Yet modernization also creates tension. Some religious leaders worry that traditional customs and institutions are losing influence. Tribal communities resist the government's attempts to limit their autonomy. Political critics question the concentration of power in the hands of the monarchy. At the same time, global events begin shaping Iran's destiny. You stand beside a radio in a small Tehran cafe as news arrives from Europe during the late 1930s. Political tensions are rising across the world. Major powers are moving toward what will soon become the Second World War. Iran's strategic location between the Soviet Union, the Middle East and South Asia suddenly becomes extremely important. In 1941, British and Soviet forces enter Iran during the war. Historians explain that the Allied powers feared that German influence might threaten vital supply routes through the region. Iran's railways and transportation networks could help move supplies to Soviet forces fighting against Nazi Germany. As foreign troops enter the country, Reza Shah is pressured to abdicate the throne. His son Mohammad Reza Pahlavi becomes the new Shah. You watch the quiet transition of power unfold in the royal palace. The younger Shah inherits a country facing enormous challenges. Foreign military presence continues during the war years. Political movements inside Iran grow increasingly. One fascinating historical detail from this period involves the growing influence of oil. Iran possesses some of the largest petroleum reserves in the world. International companies had already begun extracting oil from the southwestern regions of the country earlier in the century. Control over these resources becomes one of the most important political questions in modern Iranian history. Historians continue discussing how the relationship between foreign oil companies and the Iranian government shaped political tensions during the mid-20th century. Some scholars argue that the unequal distribution of oil revenues created widespread frustration among Iranian citizens. Others emphasize the complexity of international negotiations that influenced these arrangements. As you travel south toward the oil-producing regions near the Persian Gulf, you see towering industrial structures rising above the desert landscape. Pipelines stretch across the horizon. Workers operate refineries that transform crude oil into fuel-powering industries around the world. The ancient land, once known primarily for its empires and poetry, now holds enormous strategic importance in the global energy system. Meanwhile, political movements inside Iran continue evolving. Some leaders advocate greater democracy and national control over resources. Others support maintaining strong royal authority to ensure stability. These debates eventually lead to one of the most dramatic political crises in modern Iranian history during the early 1950s. But the story does not end there. Throughout the 20th century, Iran continues navigating the difficult balance between modernization, tradition, national independence, and international pressure. Standing on a hill overlooking Tehran at sunset, you watch the city lights slowly appear across the valley. The name Iran now represents not only an ancient civilization, but also a modern nation navigating the complexities of global politics. The long journey from the ancient empires of Persia to the modern state of Iran has passed through thousands of years of transformation, and yet the deeper identity of this land still carries echoes of everything that came before. Only one final reflection remains before the story gently comes to rest. The evening sky above Tehran slowly turns from pale gold to deep blue as the city settles into night. The distant mountains stand quietly against the horizon while the lights of homes and streets flicker gently across the valley. You pause with here at the end of a journey that has carried you across thousands of years. From the wind-swept plains where early Persian tribes once wandered to the great capitals of ancient emperors, to the modern nation now known as Iran, the land beneath your feet has seen more transformations than almost anywhere else on Earth. Long ago, you walked beside farmers digging irrigation channels across the Iranian plateau. Small tribes lived among mountains and valleys that seemed almost untouched by history. Then came the rise of Cyrus the Great, who built one of the first vast empires the world had ever known. His vision of governance created roads, laws, and systems that connected many different cultures under a single rule. You watched the Persian Empire flourish under kings like Darius. You saw markets filled with traders from distant lands and royal messengers racing along the great roads of the empire. Then you stood on the plains where Alexander's armies shattered that ancient power. Yet Persia did not disappear. New empires rose from the same soil. The Parthians guarded the Silk Road and challenged the might of Rome. The Sasanian kings revived Persian identity and built cities filled with grand arches and sacred fires. For centuries, Persia stood as one of the great centers of civilization, but history shifted once again when new ideas arrived from the Arabian deserts. The arrival of Islam transformed the political structure of the land, yet Persian culture found new ways to flourish through scholarship, poetry, and art. You walked through libraries where scholars studied mathematics and medicine. You listened to poets reciting verses that preserved the memory of ancient kings. You saw how the Persian language carried cultural identity far beyond the borders of the Iranian plateau. Even conquerors who arrived from distant steppes eventually adopted the traditions of the land they ruled. And when the Safavid dynasty rose, Persia once again became a powerful state with a distinct identity shaped by culture, religion, and history. Historians still discuss which moment most clearly marks the birth of modern Iran. Some scholars point to the Safavid decision to adopt Shia Islam as a defining element of national identity. Others emphasize the modernization reforms of the 20th century that transformed the country into a centralized nation-state. What remains clear is that the name Iran carries echoes from every stage of this long story. It reflects the ancient heritage of the Iranian peoples. It carries the memory of empires that once shaped continents. And it continues representing a civilization that has adapted again and again through changing centuries. As night grows deeper, the sounds of the modern city begin to soften. Cars move more quietly along distant roads. Conversations fade from balconies and courtyards. The cool night air drifts down from the mountains surrounding Tehran. You imagine the countless generations who lived across this land before tonight. Farmers are beneath ancient Persian kings, scholars writing manuscripts by candlelight, merchants crossing deserts with caravans of silk and spices, poets whispering verses about love, memory, and the passing of time, all of them part of the same long human story. The land that outsiders once called Persia, the land its own people have long known as Iran. And now, as the city settles into quiet darkness, the journey through its history gently comes to rest. The mountains remain still, the stars appear slowly above the plateau, and the ancient land continues its quiet watch beneath the night sky. Now the story fades softly into calm. You picture the wide Iranian plateau under moonlight. Desert winds move gently across silent dunes. Ancient ruins stand peacefully beneath the stars. Somewhere far away, a quiet fire glows inside a temple that had burned for generations. The long roads of history stretch across the land like faint lines in the sand. Empires rise, flourish, and fade, but the land itself endures, breathing quietly through centuries of change. And tonight, as you drift towards sleep, the story of Persia and Iran rests peacefully in the quiet darkness. End of script. Sweet dreams.